Okay, I think we've probably got a good number to begin, so let's kick off. So firstly, welcome again everyone to this full morning of training on the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. We'd like to really thank you for joining us here today. And really this programme is very much a collaborative effort between a number of organisations, driven by the real demand we see in the market for more support and capacity building and interest in the ISSB standards. So a big thank you to the Amman Stock Exchange for hosting this session with us today, and to the IFRS Foundation, IFC, and Bloomberg Philanthropies for their fantastic support to this programme. And of course, thank you all for joining us too. So we'll be going through the agenda and some housekeeping points, etc. shortly. But before we do, I think it would be great to hear a few welcome remarks from the ASE. So for that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Rasha Dayat, the Director of Planning and Institutional Development at the ASE, who's kindly joined us to give those remarks. So thank you very much, Rasha, and over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here and glad to see all of you. And on behalf of the Amman Stock Exchange, I would like to extend a warm welcome to each one of you. It's a pleasure to have representatives from our listed companies here today as we embark on this important training session on the International Financial Reporting Standards, focusing specifically on IFRS S1 and S2. Also, our gratitude goes to UNSSE for organizing this training and to ISSB and IFT for facilitating it. We all know that IFRS S1 and S2 enhances transparency, consistency, and investor trust in our financial statements and our disclosures. It supports essential sustainability-related disclosures addressing environmental, social, and governance factors. These standards are not only boost our market credibility, but also position us as leaders in transparency and accountability and implementing international standards. Your commitment to understanding and implementing these standards is a significant step toward our market's integrity and resilience. Thank you for your dedication, and thank you again for attending and participating in this training. And we look forward to a productive discussion as we work together to drive excellence in reporting and accountability and transparency. Thank you again, and wish you all the best, everyone, and enjoy this training. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you, Rasha. I really appreciate you setting the scene for everyone there. That's greatly appreciated. Brilliant. So we also, oh, apologies, I do have my slides in the wrong order, so I'll just skip ahead slightly to the right slide to show you. My apologies. We also have Dr. Amira Agag, who has joined us today from the IFC as well. So I'd like to also hand over to Amira to just give you a brief few remarks from the IFC's perspective as well. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you, Fiona. Everybody, hello. Assalamu alaikum. It's my privilege to welcome you to this important session on the IFRS Sustainability and Climate Disclosure Standards. Today's training is a result of the partnership between IFC, Amman Stock Exchange, the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, and the IFRS Foundation. It's aimed at strengthening sustainable capital markets by enhancing sustainability and climate reporting. Our joint efforts will ensure that the regional markets are not left behind in the global shift towards sustainable finance. Over the past few years, there has been a significant, as you know, surge in demand for sound ESG data disclosure. And of course, the launch of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards in 2023 brought a long-anticipated convergence of sustainability disclosure frameworks and climate as well. We at IFC are pleased to partner with Amman Stock Exchange in delivering this training because in Jordan there is a notable interest from the regulators in developing sustainability and climate disclosure regulations aligned with the global standards. And together with Amman Stock Exchange, we're currently working on developing the climate disclosure regulatory framework. We have been collaborating closely to create tailored approaches that consider Jordan's unique needs and challenges. Lastly, we would like to introduce you also as part of this training to the IFC Beyond the Balance Sheet platform. It's a valuable resource. You can find the link in the chat and again in the training material. Why this is valuable? Because this platform offers you sort of a step-by-step toolkit for preparing your reports that align with IFRS standards. The upcoming products that we're working on include also a self-assessment tool, which allows you to benchmark your practices against these standards. Also, there is an e-learning course, Sustainability and Climate Disclosure Essentials, which will all cover the reporting topics with real world examples. So we continuously update the platform, so we encourage you to explore these great resources regularly, to meet the evolving standards and support effective disclosure practices. We believe today's session will strengthen your understanding of these standards and support your work in advancing sustainable finance. We're committed to supporting you and the Jordanian regulators as well, and we see this as a great opportunity for meaningful collaboration. Thank you all and enjoy your learning today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amira. That's also very helpful setting of the scene. We really appreciate you joining us too. And just to note, if you have any questions for IFC, I think Amira will need to drop off at a certain point in the session, but she plans to rejoin. So do feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A and we can come back to those when Amira rejoins if needed. But thank you again. Great. So I will just flip back slightly. Apologies for the slight reordering here. Just a few points to cover off in terms of housekeeping. So firstly, you will note that all participants are on mute. However, we'd really encourage you to engage with us through the chat and the Q&A functions to share any comments you might have in the chat as we go along. And then if you have any particular questions, make sure to put those through in the Q&A box so we can keep track of responding to those. We have a whole host of panelists who I'll be introducing shortly who'll be happy to help you with your questions. So do please use both of those functions. As you've seen, so today we've got a 3.5 hour session. So we have this as a live exercise today, but there's also some homework that you can take away optionally to complete in your own time to support you in continuing your learning. As we've mentioned, we'll be following along live with the Q&A and the chat, and we'll also have some engagement and participation opportunities for you throughout the session. So we'll be using the polls within Zoom. We'll also be using Menti, so we'll be sharing some instructions and a link for accessing that. And you'll have the optional homework exercise as well. But we really do encourage you to engage and participate throughout the session. This is super helpful, both for your learning, but for us and what we learn from hearing from you, and also for your other participants as well. And finally, if you successfully join us live for this session, you will also be eligible to receive a participation certificate. And so to do so, you'll also need to complete our feedback survey. So we'll be sharing the link to that with you at the end of the session so that you can access your survey and the certificate that follows. So to introduce the speakers who will be covering off our training content today, I'm Fiona Quinlan-Wells from the SSE team. I'm a training officer with the SSE, and I'm also joined by my colleague Lois Guthrie, who is a senior specialist and will be delivering from the SSE perspective. We're also joined by our colleagues from the IFRS Foundation. So, of course, the real experts on these standards who can help you in answering any of those technical questions you might have. So we have Bella Cheng, a capacity building specialist, and Robert Swiatowski, a partnership manager also in the capacity building team. So please do make sure to make use of having everyone here today to get those questions answered that you might have in your mind. And then, of course, I've introduced Amira to you previously as well from the IFC. So then if we look at the learning objectives that we have for today's session, we wanted to run these through with you briefly. So our first objective will be to understand the ISSB standards. Our second objective is to understand how to use the standards and practice. And then finally, we want to support you in identifying what steps you can take to develop a disclosure plan to apply the ISSB standards. So to achieve those objectives, we've broken it down, tried to simplify it really into a number of kind of core modules of content that we'll be working through in the session. And these are shown on the screen here. To walk through each area in turn, firstly, we have the prepare module. So this is really about understanding the purpose of reporting, understanding the landscape of the different frameworks and standards that have really informed and led to the global baseline that is being set by the ISSB. In the align module, we'll really be helping to set the direction there. So thinking about how do you actually align to the standards, how do you understand and apply them within your own organizations, and how do you think about the different disclosure requirements that may be required to meet the needs of your geography, sector, or regulator. We'll then be moving into the implement module, so thinking really about the practices and systems that are involved in reporting. How do you identify, evaluate, and integrate those different risks and opportunities that you face from sustainability? And then we'll be closing out finally with a module on communication. So this is really thinking about the final format of your reporting once you've prepared it. So what location should it be in, the timing of publishing it, and how you can do that efficiently and with provision of confidence to your stakeholders in that information. And so to cover off those 4 modules, just wanted to share with you the agenda that we'll be following for the session. You may be pleased to know with the length of the session that we do have a short break in the midway point, just to give us all the opportunity to stretch our legs and grab another coffee or tea. So please do kind of follow along with us through that. And also feel free to ask any questions, as I've said throughout. As I presented on, we have a number of facilitators joining. So whoever isn't speaking, we're very happy to keep an eye on those questions and to give you responses as we go along. And just to mention the key materials that you'll be able to access for the session. So we should have or should shortly be sharing with you a link in the chat to our webpage for this event, which is where you probably access to sign up for the session. So on this webpage, you'll be able to find all of the materials we're covering today. So that includes the slide handouts, all of the links to the resources that we'll be discussing. After the session, we'll post the recording there, and you'll be able to access the homework handout from that page as well to complete that element. And then we'll cover off a little bit more of a description on the homework later in the session. But the idea of this handout is that it will help you to develop a draft disclosure plan for your company and really enable you to use what you've learned from this training. So it isn't mandatory to do this and there's no need to submit it to us, but this is something that we hope that will help you in supporting your continued learning and working with your colleagues really to practically put this into action within your organizations. So to speak a little bit about some of the SSE resources that can support you in this area overall, we produce a number of different resources which you can find in our SSE toolkit on our website, and the link which will be available from that QR code there. So this goes into kind of lots of detail on some of the aspects we're discussing today. And in particular, we have guidance, model guidance, which is to support stock exchange in bringing in listing requirements. But also we have particular training tools as well on the transition plan concepts, on climate-related reporting, and also a gap analysis to support you in getting started with sustainability-related financial disclosures more broadly. So please do check those resources out as well in your own time. And so to kick us off, we'd really like to hear a little bit from you all about kind of where you're at when you're joining us today and how much you already know. So to access Menti, there will be a link that takes you directly to the poll in the chat function coming shortly. And also, if you go to menti.com, you'll also be able to enter the code on the screen. So yeah, you should have received that chat link now, which I can see. So please find your way there via the link, and then I will just share screens with you to show you the results coming through, and also so that you can see the code if you have gone directly to the Menti website. So as I've said, at the top of the screen there should be a code as well. So if you've navigated to menti.com, it should be possible to enter that code to join us in the poll as well. So the first question we have for you today is just to tell us in 3 words why you've joined us in today's session. What are you hoping to get out of this? So do take a moment and let us know your thoughts there. Great. So I already see a few responses coming back. We've got exchange, to learn, to meet. So that's brilliant. I'll just give it a few more seconds for some of you else to respond. Support in my work. I think that's 4 words, but we'll let you off there. That's great. We got important, learning about the standards, learning how to disclose. A hot topic indeed, definitely. So you want to stay on top of those trends. Collaboration, sustainability, certificate, of course. We're glad that you'll have some value from that, expanding your knowledge. So that's brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. We hope we'll be able to support you in those areas in today's session. So I'll move us on to the second Menti poll that we had for you now, which I'll just move along to. So our next question for you is just to get a sense of how much you already know. So if you could use those sliders that are available to you from not comfortable at all on the left-hand side to very comfortable, just give us a sense of where you're at the moment in explaining the ISSB to your team, in using the standards, and in developing a sustainability reporting strategy. So yeah, just have a little think about where you think you're currently at about those areas, and just be useful for us to get a sense of your kind of current knowledge. Okay, let's see a few responses coming through. I'll just give it another second for a few more of you to respond. Okay, so it looks as though yeah, we're probably a little less comfortable on explaining the ISSB and using the standards, which is, of course, very understandable, and that's what we're here to support today. But perhaps a bit more comfortable on developing a sustainability reporting strategy, which, of course, makes sense because I know many of you will have been doing this already for a number of years in your organizations, perhaps with some of the different voluntary initiatives, which we'll be talking about, or other regulatory requirements. So that's great. Thank you for sharing that with us. Lovely. So I'll just stop sharing the Menti and we'll return to the slide presentation, but we will come back to Menti later in the session. So please do keep that link open in your tabs if you'd like to, so that you can revisit that when we start some other questions. So I'll just wait for the slides, which are coming through, I believe, and then we'll move along. Thank you. So a little disclaimer just to start off the session, but we want to sort of cover this just for clarity. So we'll be using a number of reporting examples as we talk along today. And these are really simply there to add some color to what we're talking about and to really show you obviously some real examples of practice to bring to life what we're saying. However, it's important just to note that these examples shouldn't necessarily be seen as good or best practice, and really just provided as an illustration or some inspiration for what you may want to consider. But of course, we recognize that each organization is different and the right way for your company may be a little different to others. So we just wanted to make sure that was clear in context before we started talking about some examples. And so I think that's everything out of the way in terms of introductions. And now we'll be moving into our first module, which I'll be starting with. So our first segment is really around building that solid foundation, as I've talked about already. And although, of course, these ISSB standards were introduced a little while ago and are new, they did really build on top of a lot of existing knowledge and frameworks and concepts that were already there. So we'll be talking a little bit about what some of those are in terms of background. So the three aspects that we like to cover here, we'd like to start with the purpose of why we disclose and the case for sustainability reporting. We'll then move on to the landscape, so how reporting has evolved, including how it's becoming simplified. And then we'll finish off this segment with the global baseline, so looking at the core concepts and requirements in IFRS 1 and S1 and S2 that form that global baseline. So to start with the purpose aspect, we're really going to be looking here at the case for disclosure and the market drivers for putting out more sustainability related disclosure. So to get started with that, we have a little Zoom poll for you, which I'll just bring up on the screen now. And we'd like to really ask you what your reasons are currently for disclosing sustainability related information. So take a moment and just let us know in that poll that should be on your screen now, what you think your drivers are. So you can select more than one. So it might be regulatory requirements, sharing your own management objectives, perhaps peer pressure from your competitors who might be reporting, maybe it's investors, or maybe you have other reasons, which feel free to share with us in the chat as well. Or perhaps you're not disclosing at all at the moment, and of course we understand that may well be the case and is absolutely fine if that's so. Great, so I see lots of responses coming in now. Thank you everyone. I'll just give you another second or two to get those in, but I see a good number of you have been able to participate, so that's brilliant. We do love to hear from you in the session, so that's great to get lots of engagement. Thank you. Okay, we'll end the poll there, I think, and I'll just share the results. So it looks like regulatory requirements are coming out really quite strongly as the top driver here for many of you to report. But of course, we have sharing management objectives and investor interest both coming through quite strongly. And then a few of you indicating perhaps those peer pressure from your competitors might be a factor, and a couple of you who maybe aren't disclosing yet as well, which of course is no problem. But yeah, it looks like regulation is a really strong driver here. And of course, as we look towards the future, I think that's very likely to be a driver for many organizations. So that makes total sense. Great, thank you. So I'll just stop sharing that poll and we'll go back into the presentation. So one driver, obviously, that we did talk about there, and I think some of you mentioned was relevant for you, is investor interest in this information. And to illustrate this, we just wanted to show this data from the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which looks at the number of investor signatories to the initiative. So we're now up to more than 5,000 signatories to the UN PRI, representing 121 trillion US dollars in assets under management. So, really shows the weight of investor interest and support behind adoption of more sustainable business practices. And so what is it that's really driving this interest from the investor community? And this study, I think, is an interesting point to highlight on this, that actually one of the key drivers that we're seeing for investors in interest in sustainability is actually financial performance and a concern about the financial effects of sustainability issues. So this study, which is linked in the slides there, you'll see from Morgan Stanley, actually found that at least for individual or retail investors, actually sustainable investing was coming into people's area of interest as something that because of financial performance. So this is something that you could take a little closer look at in your own time if you'd be interested to. But I think that brings us to our next point we wanted to clarify, which is, what do we actually mean by financial performance there when we're talking about that term? So it's important to remember that today we're talking about disclosing financially material sustainability related information. And as we come through the workshop, we'll be talking in a little bit more detail about what we mean by material. But what we wanted to be clear on from the start is what the sorts of financial effect are that investors are going to be looking for information on. So we'll start firstly with the effects on the company's performance, which we often see coming through in the P&L or profit and loss statement, which shows the company's income or revenue and its expenditure. So sustainability risks and opportunities can have a financial effect by changing the revenue mix or total revenue of a company. For example, if demand for its products and services change, perhaps its production capacity might be disrupted, for example, as a result of extreme weather events. And we could also see substantial changes in expenditures. For example, operating costs might increase due to rising energy prices, or perhaps there's a greater need to spend on R&D investment to capitalize on sustainability-related opportunities. So we can see here that there are lots of factors that may play into financial performance. And then the second element that we talk about, is financial position. So let's look at what that concept means as well. So we can often see that a company's financial position is shown through their balance sheet or their kind of statement of financial position. So for example, we may see considerations shown here relating to the value of different assets or liabilities impacted by climate or sustainability issues. So we could see changes in portfolio value, or possibly even write-off of certain assets that are damaged or stranded as a result of sustainability risks. And another financial effect that you could see documented is changes to financing and the cost of capital. So, for example, that could include increased insurance premiums as a result of climate risks to assets or operational locations. And it also can include making use of new routes to access capital through financing structures such as green bonds or social bonds. So that covers off a little on the kind of financial concepts that underlie our thinking here. And we also wanted to flag some important aspects related to sustainability risks and opportunities as well, which are really sort of essential concepts that underlie all of this. So you've probably seen these excerpts before, I suspect, from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. And I think what's interesting to see here is where we have the 2-year risks on the left-hand side and the 10-year risks on the right. We actually see that some of those risks that are front of mind in the next 2 years maybe are not the same risks that we might see in a 10-year timeframe. So what's going to be quite important for these disclosures is that we're preparing for those future risks that may not have yet materialized, but that we expect to materialize in a medium or long-term time horizon. And actually as well, that if we need to invest to either manage those risks or capitalize on opportunity, we might be seeing financial effects much earlier as a result of those investments that are required. So please keep that in mind as well, that although the impact may be long-term, the financial effect could occur in the near term. So that's something that's important to consider. And another really important aspect to highlight is the interconnectivity between different sustainability and climate-related risks. So this diagram also comes from that same WEF report, and here just shows how interconnected those different categories of ESG risk are. So many people might think of sustainability reporting topics under the ISSB as distinct things. So one standard for climate, one for other topics. But actually, as you can see here, we see a lot of interconnection between these issues. And so although we have separate standards, this doesn't remove these interconnections. And when we're reporting as a whole, we need to think about strategically how we're managing these issues in a connected way and how we're reporting upon that to our investors as well. So that's just a couple of concepts that I wanted to make sure we'd gotten clear to start with. So that kind of covers off the purpose side of our session. So I'll be moving over to Lois now, who'll be taking us through the landscape.
Thank you, Fiona, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. We've looked at why sustainability disclosure is important because of the risks involved and the interests to investors and so on. So now we're going to look at how the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards have been developed in the landscape of existing reporting standards. But first of all, we wanted to ask you via another Zoom poll, what frameworks are you currently using? So we're just going to launch a Zoom poll that asks you this question. So tell us, what frameworks are you currently using for sustainability disclosure? Is it CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project? the Global Reporting Initiative, Integrated Reporting Framework, the standards set by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board or ISSB, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or others. So we'll give you a moment to fill that in. Just to let my colleagues know, I can't actually see the Zoom being filled in, but hopefully one of our the colleagues will share the results with us. Oh, thank you. Marvelous. So we can see that most organizations that are participating in this call are using the Global Reporting Initiative framework, 54% of you. Some people are using the Integrated Reporting Framework, others ISSB, but not very many, and only about 10% of you using the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, very few using CDP. So thank you for sharing that with us. We can see that most of you are using the GRI standards. So moving on to the next slide. And apologies, I just seem to have lost the moving forward. So I'm hoping that my colleague Landon is able to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. We're looking here at the structure of the IFRS Foundation, and this is the foundation within which the ISSB standards that we're going to be talking about today have been developed. So the IFRS Foundation is a not-for-profit public interest organisation established to develop high-quality, understandable, enforceable and globally accepted accounting and sustainability disclosure standards. Within the IFRS Foundation, there are two independent standard-setting boards, and you see those in the dark blue and pale blue boxes at the bottom of the slide. The International Accounting Standards Board, formed in 2001, develops financial accounting and reporting standards, and these are in place in 140 jurisdictions around the world. The International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, was formed in 2021 following strong market demand for it to develop sustainability disclosure standards that it issued in 2023, and they are the standards we're going to be talking about today. The governance of the standard setting bodies is provided by trustees, and they in turn are accountable to a monitoring board of public authorities, and the two standards boards work very closely together. Next slide, please. So how did these standards evolve? Well, they evolved from the work of a lot of organizations that were already issuing reporting standards and frameworks. So you see the logos of these organizations on the screen, and they were listed in the Zoom poll that we just did. So many of these organizations share a lot in common because they're all working towards sustainability disclosure, but they have different objectives, guidelines, and their information that they ask for is produced for different types of stakeholders. So we know, for example, that GRI supports a broad range of stakeholders, whereas the IFRS Foundation and many of the others on this slide focused on delivering information for investors. But the one thing to take from this slide, the central message is that you'll see these arrows are here to indicate that what we see is a picture of greater consolidation and harmonization. So whereas these organizations used to be a bit confusing because there were so many of them, they've now been consolidated in some cases into the IFRS Foundation. That was the case for the three at the bottom: CDSB, Integrated Reporting, and ISSB. With the TCFD, their work has now been incorporated into the IFRS Foundation. CDP has aligned its framework with ISSB S2, and the GRI and ISSB are working very closely together to align common disclosures. So as a result, we have a lot of simplification and harmonization. Let's move forward, though, to another Zoom poll. Now, we know that not many of you are using TCFD, but let's ask this question for the purpose of understanding the landscape. And the question is, if companies currently disclose using the TCFD or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations, if they do that already, do they automatically comply with the ISSB standards? We saw that the TCFD's work has been incorporated into the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. I'll give you a moment to think about this. We see a pattern emerging here, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And we can see that 71% of you said true and 29% said false. Now, the correct answer is false. You cannot assume that if you are currently using the TCFD recommendations, that you automatically comply with the ISSB standards. So the correct answer is false. However, for those of you that answered true, the good news is that the TCFD recommendations are very aligned. There's very few differences between TCFD and ISSB. So you will be much of the way towards complying with the ISSB standards if you currently use TCFD. So we'll move on now to just have a little look at moving from TCFD to IFRS S2, and I'm hoping my colleagues will move the slide forward. Thank you very much. This is just to explain what we were talked about on the last Zoom poll. You can't assume that if you use TCFD's recommendations that you automatically comply with ISSB. The little document you see the picture of on the left-hand side is a document prepared by the IFRS Foundation that explains the differences between the TCFD recommendations and standard IFRS S2 on climate-related disclosures. And essentially, the differences are to do with differences in wording and differences in detail. So sometimes IFRS S2 asks for more information than the TCFD used to, but we won't dwell on this because we know that not many of you are using TCFD. Let's move on to the objective of the ISSB. The ISSB is focused on developing standards that form a global baseline, and that global baseline is intended to provide a common language that can enable comparable and consistent sustainability disclosures across capital markets. So what the global baseline means that building blocks can be added to it, and you can see those in the two little symbols to symbolize building blocks at the top of the blue box. So the foundation is working with jurisdictions around the world and other stakeholders to achieve this, so that those parties can add their own building blocks tailored to their own needs, including needs for stock exchanges and others, to ask companies for additional information, that is additional information to what's in the ISSB standards. So taking this, that means that the building blocks could be based on the work of organisations such as the GRI to respond to multi-stakeholder information needs, or could include jurisdiction-specific information relevant to investors and others. So taking this building block approach reduces the need to duplicate information by having a globally consistent baseline of disclosures, whilst allowing companies to report additional information based on standards like the GRI standards. There has been global backing for this approach, for a global baseline and a global standard. The standards themselves that form the baseline were issued in 2023. The International Organization of Securities Commissioners announced its endorsement of the ISSB standards and asked their 130 members to consider how they can incorporate the ISSB standards into their regulatory frameworks. The Foundation is also engaging with other stakeholders on how to support adoption of the standards and related issues. For example, they're working with the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board on the new assurance standard for sustainability reporting. As part of its regulatory implementation program, the Foundation is supporting multiple jurisdictions with planning for both the voluntary and mandatory adoption of the standards, and of course is supporting market participants who voluntarily opt to apply the standards. So we've looked at how the standards have come into being, and now our colleague Bella is going to take us through the next section.
Thanks, Lois. Yes, we've talked about the business case and the market case for sustainability reporting, the evolution of the landscape, and how it is being simplified and rationalized. Now let's introduce IFRS S1 and S2. As we start, it's important to know that there are some key terms that should be understood. You can find the definitions in your handout, but I wanted to briefly mention them here. First of all, we will be saying the phrase sustainability-related financial information quite a lot. This can refer to a broad set of issues, including climate, nature, or biodiversity, human, social, or others. And sustainability-related financial information is information about a company's sustainability-related risks and opportunities that is useful to investors in making decisions about providing resources to the company. Sustainability-related risks and opportunities are those that could reasonably be expected to affect the company's cash flows, access to finance or cost of capital. For example, it could affect the company's prospects. We will also often refer to general purpose financial reports, which includes a company's financial statements and the management commentary. You might know this as a management report, management review, or strategic report. Some regulators require specific disclosures in certain parts of general purpose financial reports, so we use this generic phrase throughout. Anyone familiar with TCFD will recognize the same 4 core pillars or content areas for the ISSB standards. These are governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. For each core content area, there are a set of key disclosures to be addressed, and the standards provide very detailed guidance on these requirements. We will discuss each of the 4 content areas today, and I encourage you to download the standards as part of your homework assignment. Now let's start with IFRS S1. I'll give it its full title, General Requirements for Disclosure of Sustainability-Related Financial Information. IFRS S1 sets out general requirements for the content and the presentation of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. If you are familiar with TCFD, you will see the same architecture applied throughout the standards. S1 asks preparers to refer to and consider the applicability of the ISSB standards and other sources of further guidance to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and also identify material information. The ISSB standards are organized by industry, enabling a company to identify disclosure topics and metrics applicable to its business model and operations. Finally, the standards can be used in conjunction with any accounting requirements. Okay, the scope of S1 is all sustainability topics except for climate, which is covered by S2. So you can see that the second standard S2 focuses on climate disclosures, building on the same foundations of S1. For example, it fully incorporates the recommendations of TCFD. It also sets out the requirements for a company to disclose material information about its climate-related risks and opportunities. And also it requires the disclosure of both cross-industry and industry-specific information. In terms of climate-related risks, this includes both physical and transition risk, which we will come back to later. Other specific climate-related disclosures are required, for example, on scenario analysis and GHG emissions. Preparers must also refer to or consider the applicability of the industry-based guidance or on implementing IFRS S2. As we've said already, this is organized by industry, enabling a company to identify climate-related disclosures, topics, and metrics applicable to its business model and operations. You should know that S1 and S2 are not standalone standards. They are a package and must be applied together. Even when a company is reporting only on climate-related risks and opportunities, the company must apply both IFRS S1 and S2. This is because IFRS S1 sets out general requirements or parameters for the type of information that needs to be provided in order to be decision useful for investors. S1 also explains the concept of materiality and how companies identify material sustainability-related financial information. Next, let's consider some of the conceptual foundations that underpin the ISSB standards, which might be new to anyone without an accounting background. These concepts help us to understand how best to disclose information in order to meet the requirements of the ISSB standards. To start with, companies must fairly present a complete set of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Fair presentation also requires disclosures to be faithfully represented. To achieve this, companies shall provide a complete, neutral, and accurate depiction of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. The reporting entity concept requires the organizational boundary for sustainability-related financial disclosures and financial statements to be the same. Another important concept is connected information. We saw earlier when Fiona explained how different risks are often interconnected. The ISSB standards require companies to clearly identify key connections, such as those between risks and the opportunities, connections between the 4 content areas, and connections between sustainability-related financial disclosures and the main financial statements. Okay, so now let's look at an example. So hand over to you, Lois.
Yes, thank you, Bella. This is our first example we're looking at today. So please remember the disclaimer that Fiona gave us at the beginning, which is that we just show you the examples for inspiration and illustration. They are not intended to represent best practice. But this example is from a company called BHP, which is a global mining company. And it is from their 2023 annual report. And it's really being used to illustrate connections between different things. So the first thing we see being connected is the connection between the company's investment process and their decarbonisation strategy and decision making. So in the first paragraph, we can see that BHP says, All investment decisions consider the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions associated with the project, the cost per tonne of CO2 equivalent associated with the project, and the alignment with the group pathways to a net zero trajectory. So first, investment decisions are connected with the decarbonisation strategy. Secondly, the decarbonisation strategy is connected with various types of expenditure currently and in the future. So you can see how much was spent on operational GHG emissions in the reporting year. That's in the second paragraph there. They spent 122 million US dollars. But you can also see from the third paragraph that the company anticipates spending around US dollars 4 billion until 2030. So we see the connection between the plan and the money spent on it. Thirdly, we see the connection between the decarbonisation projects and net present value. So this is right in the penultimate paragraph. So based on current assumptions, the achievement of medium-term targets was expected to deliver positive net present value for the group, as it has done to date for implemented projects. Final thing to notice about this this extract is the orange text right at the bottom of the extract, which guides the reader to additional information if they need it. And I'll hand back to Bella to take us through the next Zoom poll number 4.
Thank you, Lois. Yes, as Lois said, it's time for another Zoom poll. So after introduction of the a few concepts and also an example, let's have a look at this Zoom poll. It's about connected information. What information should be considered for connected information? So there are 3 choices: connections between the 4 core content areas, connections between sustainability-related financial disclosures and the financial statements, and the connections between sustainability-related risks and the opportunities. Yes, the participants have answered the question. So I'm going to end the Zoom poll and share the results. Yes, yes. Do you still remember the concepts that I introduced earlier? Well, the connected information applies to all of this, all of the 3 areas. So all of the choices are correct. Okay, so let's move on. This is about materiality. So finally, the standards are built on the concept of materiality as defined by the IFRS Foundation. We are going to go into this in more detail later, but just to highlight that we will be referring today to material information, which is information that, if omitted, misstated, or obscured, could reasonably be expected to affect investor decision-making. During the ISSB consultation on the exposure drafts, one of the key feedback topics was the importance of supporting preparers, particularly those with more limited resources and those in emerging markets. In addition to the standards and the application guidance published in 2023, a number of educational resources were also published, and since then others have followed, including the IFRS Knowledge Hub. We're also in the process of gathering examples and case studies provided by our partners. The ISSB standards were aligned with IFRS as a tool to help preparers seeking industry-based guidance, and the FSA credential was also updated with more planned to come. I should also note that the IFRS Foundation's capacity building program, which is launched at COP27, is a key part of our support to preparers, and the ISSB training initiative is one of our most important deliverables. So let's move on to another Zoom poll. Water is a vital input to our business, but the ISSB standards do not currently have a specific standard on water. What do we do? There are 4 choices. The first one is do not disclose anything about water. The second one is consult the sources of guidance listed by ISSB. The third one is engage a consultancy to help. The last one is copy your competitors' reporting. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Yes, I think most of us have answered the correct, choose the correct answer. Yes, the correct one is consult the sources of guidance listed by ISSB, such as ISSB standards. And the choice A is absolutely wrong, because water is a vital input to your business, which is it should be a material information for your company. But someone may think that choice C and choice D is helpful, but for this question, the answer is option B. Okay, so next I'm going to hand over to Fiona for the summary.
Thank you very much, Bella. Great. So before we wrap up this module with another Menti exercise, as I shared in the chat, so do make sure you've got Menti open as we come towards that next. We'll just take a few minutes before that, though, to cover off a bit of a review of what we've talked about so far. So firstly, we reviewed the purpose of sustainability-related disclosures. And a key takeaway we really hope that you take from this workshop is that there are a lot of important benefits for reporting, both internally and externally. And so, really collecting and disclosing sustainability-related financial information goes more than just applying standards, but actually gives you a lot of different benefits. And really, if you're not aiming to make good use of that data that you're collecting to really inform your strategic decision-making, then you're really missing out on an opportunity there and wasting some of your own time. So it's definitely good to make sure you have that mindset throughout. And if you operate in particularly high emissions or hard to abate sectors, your competitors may already be disclosing these risks and opportunities that they're pursuing. And then that's really going to leave your investors in a position where they're wondering why you're not taking action on these issues, which could ultimately put you in a position where you might struggle to raise funds if your investors feel that they don't understand your sustainability journey and how you're managing these issues. We then looked at the evolution of disclosure standards and the formation of the ISSB and its aim to simplify the reporting landscape. So when you're thinking about your other voluntary disclosures, you shouldn't see them as competing with the ISSB standards, but really as building blocks that the ISSB builds on top of. And finally, we introduced these standards and the important concepts you need to understand in order to use them correctly. And a key point I want to reiterate here is that these standards and guidance are designed to meet the needs of investors. And so they are heavily focused on those prospects we talked about at the beginning of the unit relating to financial effects, financial position, and managing strategic risks and opportunities. And so it's important to be clear here that that is the audience that we're talking about. So that summarizes this module. And to wrap things up, we'd now like to get your brains working on a bit of a Menti exercise again. So the question that we'd like to get you to think about here is really how can you build capacity and skills in your organization? So how do you go about working out what those skills are that you need and what the knowledge gaps are? So really a few things we've recommended thinking about here is kind of that leadership tone from the top, how you're thinking about integrating these issues into the roles of different functions and teams, and how you might have to negotiate, of course, as well with those teams to build consensus and agree resourcing. So I see some responses already coming through on Menti, which is great. And then I will just share that with you all now so we can talk through some of those options together. Okay, brilliant. So we've already got some answers in here. So I hear training, of course, awareness, surveys. Yep, so really getting a good understanding of the current state of play. Conducting training, I think, can be a very good way of actually understanding what your colleagues already know, and making sure that you have a level playing field of information. So sharing, I hope, some of what we've talked about today with them. I would start with a skills assessment of current staff, focusing on sustainability reporting, ESG practices, and data management. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Mapping requirements to existing competencies. Yes, that's a really good structure to use for sure. So actually just going to the standards and understanding particularly the topics that they cover and your capabilities. And a similar response here about conducting a skills gap assessment and a gap analysis, followed by organising training and workshops. Yeah, I think that's very good sequencing to do as well. So start by really understanding what those gaps are, and then you can really target who you're training and what you're focusing on in those training sessions to be informed by those needs. So that's brilliant. Workshops and real life scenarios. Yes, exactly. I think we all know that most of us learn best with worked examples, which is obviously what we aim to show with you today. But sometimes, yeah, taking particular scenarios from your own company and giving people little problems to think about is great. Or even if you want to, think about some generic companies to begin with, or look at other organizations, I think that can be a helpful way to slightly desensitize if there's any sensitivities to work through in your own organization first. Thank you for all of these great responses. Sharing knowledge and training sessions and brainstorming meeting. Yep, to identify areas of focus. Exactly. I think what's kind of interesting is often these standards come into a particular function, but when you start to speak to your colleagues, you'll realize that actually they may already be aware of these topics, or they might also be thinking about it, but coming at it from a slightly different angle depending on their professional discipline, whether they be a sustainability person, an accountant, a risk manager, etc. So I think really understanding the knowledge that you can gather from your colleagues from their different professional specialisms can be super important. And ultimately, no one team will have all of the answers here, as I think we all know. Yep, so identifying your stakeholders and responsibility, I think, is a good point to highlight there for sure. So if you're going to involve, different functions, I think as much as you can build out a sort of racy matrix to show who's responsible for which elements and who they need to be bringing into those conversations is really important. And then, yeah, so skills gap assessment, performing a gap analysis, training sessions. Yeah, regularly reviewing, updating training material is a very good point as well, because of course we all know that these topics are continuing to evolve and further guidance and new standards are coming. So unfortunately, training certainly isn't a one-off exercise. So yeah, making sure to keep that knowledge fresh, and I guess you need to think about the way that's right for your organization to do that. It could be little touch points or perhaps newsletters to share the main updates. Brilliant. Yeah, exactly. And then are there any specific ISSB competencies that you might need in particular, and consultations? Yeah, so I think there's a lot of great messages there. Thank you, everyone. I think we've talked on a lot of the key points there, but I think it's just really about making sure that you have the right people around the table. And if you're really missing any capacities in a particular role or remit, of course, it's thinking as well about, other resourcing conversations you need to have to secure the budget for new hires. One thing I say to organizations as well is often, sustainability reporting traditionally was done by a tiny team, and we have, often much larger teams for financial reporting and accounting. And here the adjustment that needs to be made is that actually, the level of rigor in sustainability related reporting is now coming up to that par with financial reporting. And so you need to be thinking about your resourcing for this capacity on a similar level to your traditional financial accounting. Great. So add to department HR KPIs according to annual performance assessment to conduct specialized training, yeah, that's a really good point as well. So actually using those professionals that you have who can support learning and development and integrate it into your company processes for that to make it as widely accessible as possible. Engaging subject matter experts as well. So bringing in different competencies and readiness to highlight areas of improvement. Yeah, exactly. That's brilliant. So, making sure that you're actually bringing in that external perspective on what good looks like or what approaches could work. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. There's been lots of really great answers here. And customized training programs. Just check if I think we have some similar themes, but some great answers. Mapping skills to the different data points. Benchmarking industry standards. Yeah, exactly as well. That's a really good point. There's lots of, we'll come on to it, but lots of guidance that you can already work with to start thinking about your particular industry or the particular topics you want to report on. So understanding where you're up to against those is great. Brilliant. Thank you everyone for sharing. Lots of really great ideas there. So I'll leave that open if anyone else has any more they'd like to share, but that's super helpful. Lots of great thoughts. So with that, I will now hand us back to Bella, as we're just getting the presentation back up, who will be moving us into the next module. Thanks, Bella.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, so let's continue. Next, okay. Now that we have introduced the initial concepts, let's dive into how to apply the ISSB standards, taking into account additional disclosure, including any relevant geographical requirements, as well as peer practices and your leadership's objectives. Okay, in order to understand how to ensure your disclosures meet global standards, we will look at two key concepts in this unit. The first one and the main focus of this unit will be on how to apply the standards to achieve a global baseline for disclosure. And once we cover that, we will also discuss how additional disclosures fit. To begin, let's focus first on how to apply the ISSB standards as the global baseline. Okay, let's get started on the first core content, governance. This includes aspects that relate to the governance body in your company and how management is applied. Okay, for each of the core content areas, we will discuss questions that you could ask in your company to start identifying the information that will support some of the disclosure requirements, for example, as part of a gap analysis. So if we look at the governance and management requirements, we can see that there are several that are fairly qualitative. For example, which bodies are responsible for the oversight and the management of processes, controls, and the procedures of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. For example, is management responsibility delegated to a specific role or committee? How and when do they get informed about sustainability-related risks and opportunities? How these issues inform strategy, decision-making, and risk management. This could include setting targets to manage sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Whether progress against these targets links to executive remuneration. So for more information, you can make use of the SSE checklist tool, but remember it's not a replacement for reading and using the full ISSB standards. Let's take a look at a couple examples of this to see what we mean in practice. So hand over to you, Lois.
Thanks, Bella. The first example we're looking at is from an high street bank, AIB, in Ireland, and this bank has many sustainability objectives. So as we know, companies have different governance models, and this is just one example. But what we see here is that AIB has 3 board committees: the Board Risk Committee, the Sustainable Business Advisory Committee, and the Board Audit Committee. And these organisations are in turn, these committees are in turn supported by an executive subcommittees and management that adopt the so-called 3 lines of defence model, where the approach to risk is split over those charged with governance, the operational teams, and the internal audit teams. This of course has been updated. This is an example from 2022, and all the examples we show you are constantly being updated. So you'll see a much more detailed example of this in AIB's 2023 sustainability report if you're interested. And one important thing that is described in the narrative that supports this example is the interactions between these different committees that you can see represented by the 2-way arrows between them. So the Sustainability Advisory Committee and the Group Sustainability Committee that advises it are very much linked into the work of what happens in the Group Risk Committee, for example. Let's have a look now at an example from Toyota's Sustainability Data Book 2023. Toyota, as I'm sure you know, is a car manufacturer and has many sustainability credentials, including its adoption of hybrid electric vehicles. This is an example from their what they disclose under the TCFD recommendations, used to illustrate how governance is used to inform risk and strategy. We can see 3 main things here. One, they set out the role of the board. So the board's duties, including deliberating and supervising strategies, action plans, and so on climate-related risks and opportunities, and they monitor progress and financial impacts. Second thing we see is what the board has actually done to inform strategy. So they're talking about what they are doing in relation to the company's strategy. So they've set long-term strategy on climate change, including the Toyota Environmental Challenge 2050, and they undertake regular reviews of medium to long-term targets and action plans. Then lastly, we see what actions they've taken, and these include things like the investment that's being made in the development of battery-related vehicles. Over to you, Fiona, for the strategy section.
Thank you, Lois. Great. So now with those examples hopefully making governance fairly clear, let's look at the next core content area, which is strategy. So strategy has a few more disclosures to include in governance, but it's really where organizations can see the benefits from their sustainability related opportunities and, of course, improving their management of those risks as well. So as you can see here, there are 3 high-level areas that we focus on in the strategy content area. And these are risks and opportunities, the effects, and resilience. And so we're going to review each of these ones in turn as well. So before we do that, just to touch on some of these questions to evaluate. So IFRS S1 and S2 disclosure requirements on strategy are designed to enable users of general purpose financial reports to understand a company's strategy for managing sustainability related risks and opportunities. So if we first look at the requirements relating to sustainability risks and opportunities, these are some of the questions you might want to consider. So when disclosing risks, information should include the description of the effects, the time horizons under which those effects are expected, and that should keep in mind as well that those financial effects might occur earlier than when the risk or opportunity itself materializes, or they may occur after the risk as well, indeed, if remediation is required. And the last 2 questions on this list in particular look at climate. So this aligns with the requirements, especially for the S2 standard. So, for example, investors also want to particularly understand the types of climate risk and opportunity under the categories of the TCFD framing of physical risks and transition risks, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail later. So both the S1 and the S2 standard include guidance to support companies in identifying and disclosing risks and opportunities, and recommend, for example, that you also use industry-based guidance to support this. So that could, for example, include the ISSB industry-specific standards. So again, I know an example is probably quite helpful to bring to life what we mean in the strategy pillar. So let's have a look at a couple. So this example that we have here is from the Goldfields Integrated Annual Report. Goldfields is a gold producer with mines in a number of countries, including South Africa, Australia, and Ghana. And in this extract, we're seeing them talk about the risks that they've identified and how they've really prioritized those risks and how they connect to their organizational strategic priorities. So you can really see, obviously, a number of different issues that they've identified and how they're kind of ranking the relative significance of those issues and really connecting it to their overall strategy. So it's useful to see that real integration of those issues into the core of what they're doing as a business. And so another aspect of the risks and opportunities identified as having a potential financial effect that you'll need to be considering is what we talked about at the beginning in terms of time. So you remember that we talked earlier about time. It can be quite a different consideration when you're talking about sustainability related risks or opportunities. So, you know, the time horizons may be different to those that you're used to within your standard financial reporting. And here the ISSB standards ask you to identify what time horizons any material effects are expected to occur over. So here you should be seeking to define your short, medium, and long-term time horizons. And the standards don't set what those are, but ask you to define them for your own organization because they can vary between companies. And so, for example, a number of factors that might impact what time horizons are right for you would include your particular investment and business planning cycles, the strategic horizons of your industry and your organization, the lifespan of the assets that you operate, if that's relevant, or even, you know, other factors such as, you know, geopolitics, your customer base, etc. So what's important to remember is that this time horizon needs to be explicit. So don't necessarily assume that your investors know what you're talking about. If you refer to short term or medium term, for example, make sure that you are providing a clear quantitative definition of what those ranges are for your organization. So we'll move on now to the second grouping of disclosures in the strategy section on the financial effects. So first we talked about those risks and opportunities, and now you're looking to talk about what the actual effects of those opportunities or risks may be on your business. So to start tackling the disclosure requirements of the standards, companies might want to start asking themselves questions such as describing what those effects are, understanding their response plans for mitigating or adapting to the effects of those risks or opportunities. And again, I think this is where an example might be helpful to bring to life how one organization has approached this. So here the example is from the global chemical company BASF. So the company acknowledges in their strategy that the effects of climate change, of natural resource scarcity, and pressure on ecosystems and population change as well are all impacts that may affect their organization. And so here they talk about what those particular effects may be as well. So they say that their business sector in chemical and chemistry sector had actually quite an important role to play in speaking to some of those challenges that they've identified. So for example, they speak about the need for innovation, the need to use raw materials more efficiently and reduce their waste. And also to think about things such as how they can enable healthy food production and climate smart mobility. So as well as the changes that they're hoping that chemistry and chemicals will offer society and the economy, the company itself will actually need to undergo some profound changes to respond to these drivers. And they speak here as well about some of the drivers that they'll see along the value chain. So, they can talk about, the circular economy, the services that they have, and the different segments of their value chain that will need to undertake changes. So this is just a helpful example of illustrating the implications, I guess, of some of those strategic drivers in terms of risks and opportunities and what they'll mean particularly within their organization. So one of the obstacles that companies might face when they're trying to report on these effects, however, is what kind of detail they actually have available to disclose on this. And so in that example we just shared from BASF, they were talking mostly about qualitative disclosures and descriptions, but what about quantitative information? So companies are required by the ISSB standards to disclose both quantitative and qualitative information about those financial effects of sustainability risks and opportunities. However, the standard does set some criteria for when only qualitative information might be required. So there's a particular number of circumstances where this could be the case. So for example, if a company can't separate the effects of a climate or sustainability risk from other effects, or if there is a high level of measurement uncertainty on that particular issue. Further, if the company perhaps doesn't have the skills, capabilities, or resources to provide quantitative information, then provision of qualitative information is permitted in that circumstance as well. So we've come to the last element on the strategy component, which is all around resilience. So here we're thinking about how you're actually preparing to manage those risks and opportunities and uncertainties that you may have seen. And ultimately, what's your conclusion about what that means for your organization's resilience? And this really gets into the practices and processes that the company has in place to assess this and to make strategic adjustments where it needs to. So disclosures here include information on what types of assessment an organization might have conducted, and in particular, how, if it has done so, it has used scenario analysis. So at the heart of this, we're looking really at kind of climate resilience in particular for scenario analysis, and really looking for organizations to conduct that analysis and to disclose the key inputs and assumptions they're making within that assessment. So we'll dive into a bit more detail on what we mean by scenario analysis, but some of the questions that you could consider when you're starting out with this topic internally are looking at what is the company's overall capacity to react or adjust to those uncertainties. So, simply a question of, so what, or, what might happen if you can't manage those risks that you identified? And then thinking about what those scenarios are if you're using them. So we have a couple of examples that show a few different approaches that you could take to this, because there's quite a range of approaches to scenario analysis that we are seeing. So this example here from Stora Enso, which is a Scandinavian forest products company, shows in that little diagram on the top right-hand side what they're projecting for 2030 their sales may be from their different growth areas. So they're actually saying that for their growth areas of business, which is kind of where they're really prioritizing transitioning to more sustainable practices, they're actually saying that in the future, they expect those areas to be their biggest source of revenue. So that's quite an interesting reflection that they're projecting. And so this actually shows that, they're setting out a long-term vision for how they can transition. And so they speak within the text a bit about actually the steps that they're taking to proactively reposition the business from being largely focused on pulp and paper to switching towards more renewable materials in the future, and ultimately ensuring their own viability by doing so. So this really gives a sense of both how they expect to realize opportunity from this growth, but actually as well how they'll be managing risk, and some of the steps that they plan to take, including possibly acquiring other businesses that support those skills and capabilities, perhaps converting their industrial machines and processes to support new products, and continuing to invest in innovation. So our second example for strategy is from Solvay, which is a Belgian multinational chemicals company. And here we're looking in particular at what they disclose around the financial effects of different risks and opportunities. So in particular, we want to highlight here that they're being quite transparent about the estimates that they have used within their scenario analysis. And this is a really useful approach when you're thinking about anticipated financial effects. So if you're using scenario analysis as a tool, investors really need to understand how you have used it. So you can see in this excerpt that they note the assumptions they've made, including the fact that they have used scenario analysis tools from a leading consulting firm, and in particular, what scenarios that they have considered. They also highlight that they have worked with consultants, but also used their own internal experts as well to provide input to the assessment. So if we take an example of one of the business units they've assessed, which is in the second screenshot there, we can actually see a little bit more detail about how this process unfolded for the soda ash business. So soda ash is one of the key ingredients that goes into windows, rechargeable batteries, detergents, lots of things. And it was actually invented by the founder of Soleil in terms of a process to produce it. So actually the problem with this, however, is that soda ash is a very carbon intensive process. And so the business has been really exploring more less energy intensive and carbon intensive ways of producing it. And so one of the key kind of things they highlight for this business area is that actually the costs of raw materials could significantly affect their future margins under a 1.5 degree scenario, because they would expect then that the increased demand for these materials in high efficiency buildings with more glass, for example, might actually contribute to these rising costs. So this is interesting to see, but it also shows that they have a big opportunity to improve their processes in terms of efficiency, which will help them to manage those margin impacts and be ultimately more competitive in the long term. So this is kind of their conclusion for one of their business segments, but actually they've looked across each of their different types of business line and thought about their resilience at this level, which I think is helpful to see as an example. Lovely. So to finish off this kind of overview on strategy, we have another poll question for you just now, which I will launch momentarily. So the question we'd like to ask you this time is, so a company may choose to disclose only qualitative information and or combined quantitative information about current and anticipated financial effects when, and then you need to review and consider which of the following you think are correct. So either the company cannot separate the effects of climate risks and opportunities from other effects. Secondly, is there a high level of measurement uncertainty? Or finally, that quantitative information sheds a negative light on the company. So just take a second and have a think about which you think might be valid reasons for potentially disclosing a mix or qualitative information. Okay, I see we're up to about 30% participation, so I'll just give you all a little moment more. We'll try to get over the halfway mark, I think is always good. Okay. All right, let's close off there and I'll share those results with you. So yes, most of you got that right. The first two answers are indeed the correct ones, as we already talked about. So good to know you were listening. So indeed, qualitative information is acceptable if you can't separate those particular climate risks and opportunities from other issues, or if there is too much uncertainty to be able to measure things accurately. But indeed, as most of you didn't select, the bottom option isn't a valid reason for not disclosing. So obviously, we're looking for a balanced picture here to be provided to your investors on both risks and opportunities. So it's important that if you do expect to have negative financial effects, that you are being transparent about what those might be, particularly if you do already have a sense of what those might be. So that's, for example, in that Solvay example we looked at there, they had actually disclosed a potential negative impact on their financial margins if they don't take action. So, you know, it's important to see that organizations are starting to do that. Great, thank you very much. So with that, I'll now hand us back over to Lois, who's going to talk a bit more specifically about climate in strategy.
Thank you, Fiona. So we've been through the requirements on governance and strategy in IFRS S1. Now, S1 and S2 is about the climate disclosure requirements, are really similar in relation to the requirements on governance. But when it comes to strategy, there are some specific climate considerations in IFRS S2, and we're going to take a quick look at those. So you see the title here from TCFD to ISSB, and this really is for people who are currently using TCFD. However, the list of bullet points we see here tells us really what is different in IFRS S2 about strategy, and therefore the sorts of things that you need to do when you're making climate disclosures on strategy. So let's look at this little list. First of all, S2 says that a company is required to refer to and consider the applicability of industry-based disclosure topics and industry-based guidance when they're identifying climate-related risks and opportunities. And of course, this is because climate change will affect different industries in different ways. And therefore, if you go to the IFRS website, you will be able to see the industry-based guidance to which the standard refers, and you can look up your own sector to see what types of topics you might want to disclose on. IFRS S2 also requires information about where in the business model and value chain climate-related risks and opportunities are most concentrated. So if they're physical risks, it might be that there are risks concentrated in areas where there is physical vulnerability to climate change. Third, information has to be given on the effects of climate-related risks and opportunities. So these will show what the company expects to happen and how they're responding to those risks and opportunities, perhaps through the development of new products and services. Then the IFRS S2 sets out criteria for when quantitative and qualitative information is required for the disclosure of current and anticipated effects on the risks and opportunities from climate change. So disclosure of qualitative information is permitted in some circumstances. For example, when a company cannot separately identify the effects of a climate risk or opportunity from other types of risks and opportunities, or where the level of measurement uncertainty involved is too high. When preparing disclosures on anticipated financial effects, companies only have to use all reasonable and supportable information available to them at the reporting date without undue cost and effort, and using an approach that is commensurate with the company's circumstances for specific requirements. I'm going to have a look at some of these easements, as we might call them, that are in the standards that recognise that at this stage it may be difficult for companies to quantify financial effects of climate-related risks and opportunities. So if a company is using a scenario for the analysis of an assessment of their resilience to climate-related risks and opportunities, please note that standard IFRS S2 does not specify the particular scenarios that a company should use for its resilience assessment. It is up to the company to determine which scenarios they use. There is some additional information that IFRS S2 requires about the resilience assessment, and these include things like which are the significant areas of uncertainty that the company has encountered when conducting its assessment, what is the company's capacity to adjust and adapt its strategy and business model over time to ensure that it remains resilient, and of course also details of how and when and which climate-related scenarios were used should also be disclosed. Let's look at another particular aspect of S2, and this is that if a company has a transition plan, it should disclose details about it. Now, IFRS S2 does not require a company to have a climate-related transition plan, but it does say that if a company has one, it should disclose certain information about it. A transition plan is defined as an aspect of the company's overall strategy that includes targets, actions, or resources for the transition towards a lower carbon economy, including, for example, greenhouse gas emissions reductions plans. So because transition plans are an aspect of the company's overall strategy, the first bullet point here says that they should align internally with that strategy so that the business case, the business motivation, and decarbonisation levers are coherent with the strategy and are those that are most economically and technologically feasible for the company. The transition plan should also align with external information about science. So what does science say about what's needed for a net zero pledge to be consistent with science, to be consistent with international goals such as Paris-aligned commitments? Thirdly, the transition plan should set long-term goals, and they should be supported by activities and targets to achieve those goals, including interim targets and milestones and systems for monitoring progress against them. There is uncertainty, of course, about the transition. So given that uncertainty, the plan should be transparent about any dependencies for the success of the plan, any risks and challenges of executing it, and should also explain how residual and unabated greenhouse gas emissions will be treated. As we said earlier, the transition plan will proceed in different ways for different sectors, and therefore it's useful to look at how sector-specific pathways inform the development of a company's transition plan. And we're going to look at some resources that could help with that in the next slide. And finally, companies should be aware that their transition plans are going to be evaluated by investors and others, and they should therefore ensure that the plan has the hallmarks of credibility, and these are also set out in guidance. Let's have a look at some of the resources that could help you. So there are a lot of resources, much more than we can put on this slide, but in the middle you will see 3 documents that have been prepared by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and these set out the expectations of transition plans from real economy companies, from financial institutions, and they also show some sector pathways for financial institutions. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see the task force on the transition plan task force work. They've set out a disclosure framework and many other documents that help with transition plans and transition planning. And this work, as we said earlier, has now been taken over by the IFRS Foundation. So the Transition Plan Task Force resources, insofar as they relate to disclosure, can now be found in the IFRS Foundation Knowledge Hub, which we'll be talking about later. The triangle, the pyramid on the left-hand side, is just there to show that each of these initiatives is there to support each other. So the TPT's work on disclosure is very much to support companies in how they respond to the IFRS Foundation's disclosure requirements on transition. So you'll be pleased to hear that we're now going to move into a 5-minute break. So please enjoy a stretch and a drink. The timer is there to show you when the break will be over, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome back from the break. Hope you had a chance to stretch and have a drink. Thank you very much for there are a few questions coming through now. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box because we're here to help you. There's a team of people that can answer your questions if you have anything specific. And thank you for your kind comments about the presentation as well. So we're going to move on now to look at the next core content area, which is risk management. Now, we know from the strategy section that it requires companies to disclose their sustainability-related risks and opportunities. This core content area is focused on process. So you can see from the slide here that the requirements are focused on what process is used for risk management and whether that process is integrated into the company's overall enterprise risk management processes. So what type of questions will you need to ask yourselves to evaluate what type of information you'll need to disclose? Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So as I just said, this is about process. So a company is required to disclose information about the processes and related policies for risk management it has for sustainability. So what processes and policies are used to identify, assess, prioritize and monitor sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and how are those processes integrated into the overall process. So you might want to be looking within your company about what are the risk management processes? Are they the same or different for sustainability? What inputs and parameters are used for risk management? How are the risks and opportunities prioritized? What criteria are used? Are the criteria for assessment to do with likelihood and magnitude and nature? How are those risks and opportunities monitored? And have the processes changed since the last period? So they were the general types of risk management disclosure requirements in S1. Now what we're going to do is look at the climate-specific considerations on risk management that are in IFRS S2. First of all, for those of you, as we know, many of you are using TCFD, but the thing to note here is that S2 asks in particular about what type of input parameters are being used to identify climate-related risks, whether scenarios have been used to inform climate risk identification, and whether and when risk management processes have changed between reporting periods. There are also disclosures required on the process for identifying, assessing, prioritizing, and monitoring climate-related risks and opportunities, and how that informs the company's overall risk management process. So the other thing to note about IFRS S2 is that it actually defines climate-related risks. In Appendix A to S2, there is a definition of climate-related risks, and they're divided into two types of risks: transition risks that arise from efforts to transition to a lower carbon economy, and often these are categorized as policy and legal, technology, market and reputational risks. Now there are examples of the risks in the middle column here. So they could include things like increased pricing of greenhouse gas emissions, exposure to litigation, costs of transition to lower emission technologies, and so on. But what's important to note is in all cases, these types of transition risks could have effects on the company's financial performance, including their cash flows, access to finance, cost of capital, and these effects could be felt over different time horizons. The same applies with the physical risks. They are two types of physical risks that are defined: acute ones that arise from weather-related events such as storms, floods, droughts and heat waves, which we can see are increasing in severity and frequency; or chronic physical risks that arise from longer-term shifts in climatic patterns, such as changes to rainfall and temperature, increases in sea level, reduced water availability, biodiversity loss, and changes in soil productivity. There are some examples of the types of risks that this can cause in the middle of the slide again. So the way that changing weather patterns can affect the company. And again, these have financial effects over different time horizons. Similarly, in IFRS S2, we see that climate-related opportunities are defined, and these refer to the potential positive effects arising from climate change for a company. So these can arise from efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, including things like making better resource efficiency, using different energy sources with lower carbon emissions, developing different products and services for changing consumer demand for sustainable products, supporting policy incentives that encourage these opportunities to be maximized, and working on the company's resilience. So there are some examples in the middle of the slide, some of which we've just talked about, including access to new markets through the development of new products, perhaps. And again, the thing to note is that these opportunities can have financial effects for the companies. We saw an example of this from Stora Enso earlier, where they showed the expected increased revenues from more sustainable products. And of course, these financial effects manifest over different time horizons. So there's now an example that we're going to look at, and this is an example from NATS, which is the UK air navigation service provider handling UK domestic and North Atlantic air traffic control. So we know that bad weather already causes delays for airlines, airports, and passengers, and this can often lead to increased CO2 emissions due to aircraft circling or being diverted and airspace becoming congested or inefficient. So what we see here is the company actually analysing the acute risks and impacts it has from weather, both in 2019, in 2050, they're looking at the future acute risks and impacts, and they're also looking in the final column here about what this might mean for flight durations and what it might mean for fuel consumption. So, having been through those examples about climate risk, I'm now going to hand over to Bella to take us through metrics and targets.
Thanks, Lois. Okay, so we will now spend some time reviewing the disclosure requirements on metrics and targets in more detail, the final core content area of the standards. Let's start with metrics. Requirements on metrics are designed to enable investors to understand the company's performance in relation to its sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Preparers shall disclose information explaining how the metrics are defined, if they are absolute or relative, if they have been validated by a third party, as well as the methodology. For example, what is the method of calculation, what were the inputs, other limitations, and what assumptions are involved. Now let's move on to the second part of this category, targets. Requirements on targets are designed to enable investors to understand targets a company has set to monitor progress towards achieving its strategic goals. Disclosures include whether they are qualitative or quantitative, and whether it's set voluntarily or by law or by regulations. The metric used to set the target and to monitor progress towards its achievement. And also disclosures include the baseline period from which progress is measured and the period to which the target applies. What are the milestones and the interim targets? If there have been any revisions to the target, together with an explanation about the revisions. Okay, so next, let's look at another example. Hand over to you, Lois.
Thank you, Bella. This example is from ArcelorMittal, which is a multinational steel manufacturing and mining company, and it's from its 2022 report. So here we're looking at the way in which they describe aspects of their metrics and targets. The first thing we see is their overall ambition. So the company wants to have a leadership position within the steel industry and achieve net zero steelmaking globally by 2050. So that sets the tone for what we might expect their metrics and targets to be. We can see in the middle paragraph there, in the first pane, that the targets are to reduce carbon emissions intensity by 25% globally and 35% in Europe by 2030. We also see that they tell us what is the scope of those targets. So they cover scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions for steel and mining per ton of crude steel. The company also tells us in the first paragraph there that in 2021, they set out their roadmap for achieving medium-term 2030 targets. And they also have commitments by 2050, as we saw. So we know what the roadmap is, and that sets the tone for the targets. We also see in the first paragraph their anticipated gross investment for this, which is approximately $10 billion US. On the right-hand side of the screen, the company is really setting out the dependencies for its success in achieving these targets, which include a supportive regulatory framework, and they also tell us very clearly what are the assumptions behind their plan to deliver these targets. And there's a lot more information in their report, of course. So now I'll hand back to Bella to take us through the climate-specific considerations on metrics.
Thanks, Lois. Okay, now let's talk about some of the climate-specific considerations for disclosures on metric and targets. The TCFD framework included recommended disclosures, which IFRS S2 builds on, and S2 as part of required disclosures. For example, IFRS S2 requires disclosure of industry-based metrics relevant to a company's business model and activities. Additional disclosures are required on GHG emissions, including separate disclosures for the consolidated accounting group and the associated joint ventures, and the information about the company's financed emissions. In addition, S2 sets out a Scope 3 measurement framework to provide guidance for preparing Scope 3 GHG emissions disclosures. While S2 doesn't explicitly require a company to disaggregate its GHG emissions disclosures by the constituent gases, S1 includes requirements on disaggregation that would result in the disclosure of the constituent gases being required if such disaggregation provides material information. I'd like to remind everyone that you can access more information on climate metrics in the ISSB's training tool on this topic. We will share the link in the chat box, and you can also find it on the ISSB's website. Likewise, there are some additional disclosures compared to TCFD for targets as well. For example, IFRS S2 requires disclosure about how the latest international agreement on climate change has informed the target, and whether the target has been validated by a third party. S2 also requires disclosure of more detailed information on GHG emissions targets, including additional information about any planned use of carbon credits to achieve a company's net GHG emissions targets. And S2 also includes additional requirements to disclose information about the approach to setting and reviewing each target, and how it monitors progress against each target, including whether the target was derived using a sectoral decarbonization approach. Questions on GHG emissions often come up in questions on metrics and targets disclosures, so we wanted to address some of these briefly. For those who might not be familiar with the different scopes, I'd like to introduce the three types of scope. Scope 1 includes all direct emissions that occur from sources owned or controlled by the company, such as emissions from your company's facilities or vehicles. And the Scope 2 includes emissions from generation of acquired and consumed electricity, steam, heat, and cooling, such as the electricity you purchase. And finally, the Scope 3 is then all other indirect emissions that occur in the company's value chain. S2 requires a company to disclose its absolute gross Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 GHG emissions in accordance with the GHG Protocol Corporate Standard, unless a jurisdiction requires a company to use a different approach to measurement. If a company is using a different measurement method, there is a transition relief to use that method in the first year of applying the standard. Whether and how the company is using an internal price on carbon for decision making, and whether and how executive remuneration is linked to climate change. So next, we're going to look at another example. So hand over to you, Lois.
Thanks, Bella. And this example is from Enel, which is an Italian manufacturer and distributor of electricity and gas. And it explains how they report their Scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions and how they break them down to give more detail to the reader. So as we said earlier, this is just one example of how it can be done and how Enel has chosen to disclose these figures. So at the top of the page, you can see the company's carbon footprint broken down by scopes 1, 2, and 3. You can see that they've also given a comparative analysis from 2021 in the light green bars and 2022 in the dark green bars. So we see each of scope 1 and 2 and 3, and we see the total emissions. So presenting the information in this way means that we can see the largest source of emissions come from scope 3 and the next from scope 1. Then at the bottom of the page, you can see how the Scope 1 emissions are broken down by business lines, generation, trading, networks, end customers, and other. And you can see immediately through the bars that the majority of Scope 1 emissions come from generation from thermal sources, from the combustion of fuels in generation activities. There is some little numbers above, just in the middle of the boxes, and these refer to notes. So if we refer to note 1, which isn't shown here, but is in the report, you can see that the majority of emissions were carbon emissions, but there were also emissions from methane and other gases. The little coloured dots refer to whether and to what extent the greenhouse gas source is considered within a science-based target. So you can see that that's in the narrative elsewhere in the report. So the point here is that one little diagram tells you so much about the amount of emissions, the type of emissions, the type of gas, the source, the trend over 2 years, and whether the emission source is included in a science-based target. So let's move on to a poll just to test our understanding on metrics and targets. And the question here is, what is the objective of the ISSB's requirements on metrics? You can choose as many as you want answers here. It's multiple choice. Is the objective to understand the company's performance in relation to its sustainability-related opportunities, to understand its progress against any targets, or to understand the company's assumptions from the futures? Which or all of these apply? Thank you for your active participation in these polls. You can see that a pattern's more or less emerging, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And we'll see that the majority of you answered the first two, and you are correct. Now, the reason for asking you the question in this way is to encourage you to look at the ISSB standards, as Bella suggested earlier, because each of the requirements starts by setting out its objective. So the objectives on metrics and targets is set out in paragraph 45 of IFRS S1, and it says that the objective of sustainability-related financial disclosures on metrics and targets is to enable users of general-purpose financial reports to understand the entity's performance in relation to its sustainability-related risks and opportunities and progress towards any targets the company has set or that it is required to comply with by law or regulation. So although I would say that metrics can be very helpful for a reader to understand the company's assumptions for the future, the wording of the standard is that the objective covers the first 2 points here. So hopefully that illustrated the benefits of looking at the standard itself, as it helps you to determine what to disclose for your company. So let's now go to the next section, which is on Align. It's the next submodule of the Align section, and we're going to talk about integrating disclosure requirements that companies may be required to do with the ISSB disclosures. So we've covered all the core content areas, and we're now going to look at actually making disclosures where you have a range of things that you have to do. So we talked about this global baseline earlier, which is meant to set a common language onto which regulators and others can add these building blocks. So what might they be? They might be local requirements for both listed and non-listed companies, including listed requirements. They might also apply to companies in your supply chains who need to be prepared to provide information to their procuring parties. They might be disclosures that you're required to make in addition to the baseline disclosures because of policy objectives. So governments might offer incentives to promote sustainable activities like tax cuts or subsidies, or they might also implement disincentives to counter activities that jeopardize their national sustainability objectives. Companies might also want to provide additional disclosures because of emerging industry standards and practices. As we've already said, the climate and sustainability risks will proceed in different ways for different industries. So is there something specific you need to report about your own sector? Companies should also identify the other stakeholders to whom they might want to provide information, and there might be additional disclosures that they give for those specific stakeholders. So what's happening with the adoption of ISSB standards? Each jurisdiction has to decide how or whether to adopt the ISSB standards. So national regulators are also around the world are already making decisions and consulting with the public on when, whether and how they adopt the ISSB standards. There are more than 20 jurisdictions that have already committed to using the ISSB standards. They're in various stages of development in their thinking, and together those jurisdictions account for around 55% of global GDP. You can see more about this in the regulatory implementation program information that's on the IFRS website, and the IFRS Foundation gives dedicated support to jurisdictions around the world that are thinking of adopting these standards voluntarily or mandatorily. In addition, the IFRS Foundation is working with organisations that have developed voluntary standards, and some of these we've talked about already. So they work with CDP to ensure, and CDP has taken the ISSB's climate standard as the foundational base for its climate disclosure questionnaire. The ISSB is working with the GHG protocol team, so the organisation that sets the rules that the ISSB says must be used for the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. So the governance arrangements are such that the ISSB is now actively involved in updates to the greenhouse gas protocol standard. The GRI and ISSB are working very closely together. We're going to look at that in a moment. We've already talked about the fact that the Transition Plan Task Force materials are now the responsibility of the IFRS Foundation and are on their Knowledge Hub. And as they develop their work plan on nature-related disclosures, the ISSB is considering how they can build upon the recommendations of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. This, as I said earlier, we come on to look at the GRI in a bit more detail. You can see on the left-hand side a thumbnail of a document that the GRI and IFRS Foundation have issued about the extent to which their respective requirements on greenhouse gas emissions reporting are aligned. There's a memorandum of understanding setting out the two organisations' commitment to jointly identify and align common disclosures that address information needs under the distinct scopes and purpose of the respective standards. We've seen the mapping that they've introduced, which is on the left-hand side, and there's a collaboration to deliver full interoperability as nature-related and biodiversity standards are developed, so that the GRI's 101 biodiversity standard is taken into account, and the IFRS Foundation is a founding member of GRI's Sustainability Innovation Lab in Singapore. As we all know, there are European laws now on the disclosure of sustainability information under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And the standards that support these are known as European Sustainability Reporting Standards, developed by the standard setter known as EFRAG. And Fiona's giving us some information about the mapping work that has been done between the European Commission and the IFRS Foundation to show the high degree of alignment between them on climate-related disclosures, and the collaboration between Europe and the IFRS Foundation is continuing to ensure that there's a high degree of alignment between the standards that they respectively develop to reduce complexity and duplication for companies that are required or choose to apply both sets of standards. Some of you are using integrated reporting, and here we see a document that's been produced by the IFRS Foundation to explain how integrated reporting can be used as a complementary tool when using IFRS S1 and S2. So when used together, these can support a more holistic view of the value creation process to provide a more complete picture of how value is created over time whilst meeting the needs of investors for material, comparable, consistent information on sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So there are some tools referred to in the document that you see, and also some mapping tools and frequently asked questions that help companies that wish to use integrated reporting practices to support sustainability disclosure under IFRS standards. And perhaps the most important thing to note here about integrated reporting is that it's underpinned by integrated thinking that can enhance the quality of a company's corporate governance and also coherence between all the different functions and departments that need to contribute towards sustainability disclosure. There's more about this in the handout that you have available to you. So let's go to another poll. And this poll asks you, should your disclosure initiatives consider the ISSB standards only, or the ISSB standards and regulatory requirements, just regulatory requirements, or the ISSB standards, regulatory requirements, and other sources of guidance? And you can only choose one answer here. Yes, I can see that you have got this right already. Quite a clear pattern emerging. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. The majority of you said that the last one applies. So in considering your disclosure objectives, you can consider the ISSB standards and, of course, regulatory requirements, which you must, and other sources of guidance, such as integrated reporting, to help you with your disclosures. So I'll stop sharing the result there and hand back to Fiona, who will take us through a summary of module.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lois. That's great. So as Lois said, we've now come to the end of module 2. So halfway there on the content. Well done, everyone. Although those were our larger modules, you'll probably be pleased to know. But before we wrap up with another Menti exercise, so just a quick prompt to please go back and make sure you've got Menti open again if you haven't already. But before we do that, we'll just take a quick minute to remind ourselves of what we have learnt from this module. So we reviewed all of the 4 content areas of the ISSB standards. So that's governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. But an important thing to remember here is that these don't operate in silos. And we saw in our examples that despite having 4 separate categories of disclosure, in practice, these are all interconnected, and we see that coming through in the way that companies are reporting on these issues. We also talked about how your disclosure might go beyond the requirements of S1 and S2, for example, to meet different stakeholder needs or regulatory requirements in certain jurisdictions or particular standards for your industry. And so what's important to remember when you're doing this is that the ISSB standards have purposely been developed to act as a baseline, and the building blocks approach allows report preparers to add additional disclosures on top. But in doing so, you do need to be careful that you don't obscure the requirements of S1 and S2 at the same time. So that just gives us a little bit of a summary, and then we'll be going back into Menti now for our next exercise. So this exercise is looking really at what we've talked about in this module regarding alignment and what tools you really need to use and identify that could help you to identify those gaps in your disclosure. So here we're thinking about, understanding what the gaps are and understanding how you address those gaps. So what we'd like you to take a moment to consider is what the best way within your organization, or more generally, what the best way might be to go about addressing those considerations. So I will share screen with the Menti again, and I see, as we've had it open for a little while, some of you have been very helpfully giving us your thoughts on this already, which is fantastic to see. I'll just make that full screen so it's a bit bigger for us all. So I think what we're really seeing here, which is good, is quite a lot of details, and that's great. So we've got a few responses here already. So talking about using gap analysis tools to benchmark the standards and looking at stakeholder feedback Yes, exactly. So if you already hear from your investors, or perhaps you have ESG ratings reports and you know that you perhaps have particular disclosure gaps already from those, that can be a really helpful starting point to know what you might need to do more on. Materiality tools is a really good point. So suggestions on using data Moran or ISSB to look at these. So exactly, these tools can be helpful to look at the structure of, what topics you would be expected to usually find material in your industry sector, or to make sure that you're assessing any issues that you perhaps haven't already considered. Conducting a skills audit with sustainability, finance and compliance. Yeah, so looking across all of your teams together. Benchmarking, targeted trainings, consulting with experts. Yep, that sounds brilliant. So some similar thoughts here. Just scroll down, see what else we've got. So yeah, lots more on the gap analysis, materiality assessment tools front. As someone's pointed out here, using those existing frameworks that give you quite a lot of color on the detail. And as we've shared with you already, there's been a number of mapping exercises that have been completed between those different initiatives. So those can be really helpful to understand how to move across between the different voluntary frameworks towards the ISSB standards. Yep, some similar thoughts on that front. Data mapping software. So use data mapping tools to assess the flow and coverage of sustainability related information across departments. This helps identify gaps and inconsistencies. Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic approach. And as you say, like getting into that detail of where that data sits, how it's currently been collected, and what the governance is around it already will be really helpful. And getting, I think, your financial control colleagues involved in that so that you can start to bring in some of the level of rigor in accounting that they would have in their approaches, and applying that to sustainability data is really useful. Brilliant, lots of good answers in here. So some examples of some software that you can use on the data front is super helpful. So thank you for sharing those tools that are working for you. Internal audit and self-assessment. Yes, exactly. And, if you have an internal audit function, I think, getting your colleagues, I know sometimes it's hard to volunteer ourselves to be audited, but actually getting your audit colleagues to support you in doing a structured assessment can be really good as a preparedness exercise. Comparison to industry peers. Yes, exactly. So, looking at who's really leading in your sector in terms of disclosure, what those parallels are in terms of your risks and opportunities. More on the gathering feedback, and we have some additional stakeholder groups highlighted here beyond investors in terms of customers and employees. Yeah, exactly. That's all very helpful just to get a sense of what those stakeholders expect from you. Lots of good answers here. Using risk management software. Exactly. So, as we've talked about here, we're really looking to embed consideration of these risks and opportunities into your existing enterprise risk processes. So adapting and using those existing risk assessment processes is a very good approach. Hosting workshops. Yeah, I think we'll agree with that, of course, from today, that we very much think workshops are a great way to bring people together on these topics. More surveys, consultants, materiality tools. Yep. And yeah, existing data tools such as SAP, if you have that within your organization. Exactly. External audit reviews. Yes, exactly. So although, as we'll touch on, assurance is not at this time a requirement of the standards, speaking to assurance providers is certainly a very good way to start to understand the level of rigor that you may need to bring to this topic. And whether you go for full assurance or not, you can get them to do sort of pre-assurance readiness on your disclosures and processes as well, which can be a very helpful learning exercise. And yes, another reminder on using those existing standards and materiality tools. Thank you, everyone. I think there's some fantastic ideas there. I will check. I'm not sure if we've highlighted anything in our area that you haven't already mentioned. But of course, just a quick reminder on the various training tools that we provide as an organization that I think we've shared the links to already in the chat. So a great toolkit of resources there. Of course, looking at the S1 and S2 standards themselves as that baseline to always go back to. Looking at the standards and their accompanying guidance is, of course, a great place to anchor yourself in this exercise. The mapping exercises that we've already talked about, referring to those, the mapping between the different standards. And then finally, of course, as well, we've talked here that the structure of a lot of this content is very similar to that structure that was put in place for the TCFD on climate. So if you have already reported on TCFD, that should give you a really good running start in terms of that structure that you will need to follow for the other topics. And perhaps if you haven't done, looking to peers in your industry sector who have reported to TCFD might give you a really good idea of how to go about that within your particular industry as well. Lovely. Well, thank you everyone for sharing with us in that exercise. That was great to get your thoughts. So I'll hand over to Lois now to move us into our next module.
Thank you, Fiona. So welcome everybody to the next module, which we call Implement. And this, in the last modules, we've looked at how the standards were developed and the detailed content requirements of the standards that tell us what companies must report. But now we're moving on to look at practically how this is done, including practices and processes needed to decide what data to disclose specifically and how to get things done. So there are three parts to this unit, and they are about identifying sustainability related risks and opportunities, evaluating how various parts of your information, and lastly, how to integrate sustainability related processes into your existing processes, or whether you need to develop something new and specific. First of all, let's look at how to identify sustainability related risks and opportunities. So there's two types of guidance that we can find within the ISSB standards. First of all, guidance on which risks and opportunities to report on. And this will be partly determined by your own enterprise risk management process, of course, but which risks? Well, we know that the IFRS S1 asks companies to provide material information on all sustainability related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect the company's prospects. And IFRS S2 sets out the requirements for climate disclosures. But what about how to identify sustainability related risks and opportunities beyond climate, or how to identify the risks and opportunities themselves? Well, here it's useful to turn to paragraphs 54 and 55 of IFRS S1, because they state that when identifying these risks and opportunities, consideration must be given to the ISSB standards that can be found on the IFRS website. In addition, where they want to report on issues other than climate, so on biodiversity or human rights or water, for example, companies may consider other materials, including industry practice materials and materials of investor-focused bodies, including the CDSB framework application guidance, which covers a range of subject matters and different industry practices, as I think I saw someone refer to in the chat earlier. So have a look at these paragraphs 54 and 55. Then, of course, we need to determine, well, which information do we actually disclose? Again, the standard says that companies shall consider the ISSB standards for this purpose and may consider, to the extent that it meets investor information needs, other sources, including the GRI standards and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So this goes back to the Zoom poll we had earlier, which you answered correctly, which is you can look across different sources of guidance for determining how to identify and disclose sustainability related information, but just make sure that this is for the purposes of the ISSB, that the objective of meeting investor information needs takes priority. Here we're going to look at an example of how Yara has identified its risks and opportunities, and bear in mind that this was done before the ISSB standards were introduced, so this comes from their 2022 integrated report, and Yara is an international global crop nutrition company. So what we see here is in the top right-hand corner, Yara has started with looking at global macro and mega trends that can influence the markets in which they operate and their activities. So they're looking here at geopolitical and trade uncertainty and about things that are trends such as the circular economy. These macro trends inform how they then go on to think about the specific risks and opportunities that arise from those for their own company. So in the risks box that we see at the bottom there, they've translated those megatrend risks into things like regulatory changes, consumer demand for more sustainable products, perhaps optimized fertilizer use could lead to it actually could lead to lower fertilizer demand growth, because the risk is that through optimizing the fertilizer use, it may actually mean that less fertilizer is used for this company. So it's sustainable, but presents a risk for this company. They point to environmental costs and taxes that could increase their costs. And of course, for a global crop nutrition company, physical climate change risk to their operations and customers present real risks. On the opportunities side, they see that there are opportunities to develop digital tools to enable new market channels, reduce yield gaps, and support farmer connectivity. So this would be things like using drones to observe and increase connectivity. They see that a focus on soil health, water use, and biodiversity might actually support them in activities that give better use of fertilizers for a positive impact. And so they point to different risks and opportunities for their companies, the company that is linked to the global macro trends. Let's have a look at a different approach now. This is from a company called Nest, and it's an extract from their 2023 annual report. They're a company based in Finland, and they produce sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, and feedstock solutions for the chemical industry. So they're using science and technology to transform waste and resources into renewable fuels and circular raw materials. In other parts of the report, you can see what their ambitions are to reduce their own carbon emissions and reach carbon neutral production by 2035. This extract comes from the climate section of their annual report, and it shows how the company identifies both risks and opportunities in 3 different temperature scenarios. So a 1.5 temperature scenario is their net zero world, a 2-degree scenario, and then a 2.5 to 3-degree scenario, which they describe as compromised climate targets in the last column there. The extract really shows their overall assessment, given the risks and opportunities they've identified, of whether a scenario is positive or otherwise for their company. And right at the bottom of the table, you can see that they have given indicative financial effect as well. So in summary, they have concluded that the most positive indicative financial impact, given the scenario and the risk and opportunity, is in the net zero or 1.5 temperature scenario. And this is perhaps to be expected, that they would find the greatest opportunity and the best financial impact there, because their business model is focused on the development of renewable fuels and circular products. So we know and we've said a bit about this earlier, that some of these disclosures and some of the practices for identifying and disclosing on risks and opportunities and thinking about financial effects are actually quite difficult for many companies because they're so new and companies haven't had an opportunity to develop their in-house capabilities for dealing with these requirements. So it's challenging, but it is a valuable exercise. So to make sure that the effort involved by companies is proportional to the benefit, the ISSB standards specify that in applying some of these requirements, companies just use all information available to it at the reporting date without undue cost and effort. So what do we mean by reasonable and supportable? This means that the information the company uses must be specific to the company. And we saw that Yara did that in their example. They were aware of the global trends, but they made the risks and opportunities specific to their company. Sometimes the reasonable and supportable information can take account of the external environment, as we saw. It should include information about past events and current conditions the company will already know about, but also its forecasts. And in some cases, the information that is reasonable and supportable is specified in the ISSB standards. One last thing to note is that the ISSB standards also say that for some of the requirements, a company is only required to use an approach that is commensurate with its skills, capabilities, and resources. So Fiona's going to take us through the next part of the implement module.
Thanks, Lois. That's great. So as Lois said, we're moving on now to the next part of implement, which is evaluate. So once you have identified those risks and opportunities, this is where you then need to be evaluating the financial effects of them. And this can, of course, be quite a daunting task when you're first getting started. So here we'll cover a few of the key concepts that might help in beginning of this underway. So to help investors to understand a company's resilience, in particular to climate risk, the S2 standard requires a company to disclose information about the implications of climate change on its strategy and business model. And it also asks the company for financial and operational capacity information on whether it will be able to adjust or adapt over the short, medium, and long term to these issues. So this is speaking to the concept of scenario analysis that we already touched on, and here we're going to go into that in a little more detail. So for example, at a high level, your company might want to be thinking about testing its resilience to a new regulation to limit high emissions activities, or it might want to think about how it could adapt to changing crop yields as a result of more frequent heat waves, for example. And so to do this, you need to use scenarios which draw from climate science and analyze how these scenarios will lead to an effect on the company. And it's important when we're talking about scenario analysis to remember that scenarios are not intended to be predictions of the future. It's a tool to test plausible potential futures. So you're not trying to say that this is what will definitely happen, but really just say, okay, well, what if this pathway were to be followed? What would that mean? And by considering different possible pathways, you'll help to build your resilience to those different potential futures. And so S2 does not prescribe particular scenarios for companies to use because the actual scenarios that you'll use may differ depending on what sector you're in and what particular areas of your resilience you want to stress test. However, what S2 asks is that organizations use relevant scenarios for them, and they provide information about which scenarios they've selected. It also asks them to provide information on the assumptions that are included within the scenario that has been selected, and it provides guidance to companies on how it can determine its approach in this space. And the guidance provides a range of practice from qualitative scenario narratives, so perhaps starting out in a more simple way where you just ask questions of what if associated with those risks and opportunities you identified, moving all the way through to more complex quantitative modeling approaches that organizations with a high exposure may need to progress to, or indeed you may just build up your maturity over time as you progress your understanding. So overall, the ISSB standards here are looking for an approach that is commensurate with the company's circumstances, and that use all reasonable and supportable information available to the company at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. So I think in terms of proportionality here, a lot of that rests on how high you see the exposure being to the risks and opportunities. So of course, in a sector that's quite high carbon intensity or is particularly reliant on physical climate, such as agriculture, the expectation for detail will be higher than perhaps a company in a services sector that may be less exposed to some of those considerations. So again, we'll use a few examples to zone in on some different approaches that organizations are taking to this disclosure area. So here we have an example from Cemex, who are a Mexican buildings company with cement in particular. And here you'll see that they have used 3 different scenarios, which draw from the work of the IEA. They have then assessed their different risks and opportunities for their probability and anticipated impact under these different potential scenarios. And then you can see here how that shows how things may play out a little bit differently for them under those different scenarios. And alongside this kind of summary table within their reporting, they also disclose the particular assumptions that sit behind these scenarios, the source for those scenarios, and what temperature rise they would expect to see from them. And so interestingly, it's also kind of important to see here that they see a balance of both risk and opportunity. And that actually, as you can see under this net zero emissions scenario, which is the most ambitious one in terms of decarbonisation, the opportunities for them will actually be greater. So it kind of highlights why it's important that they align their strategy towards decarbonisation efforts, because there's actually a lot of opportunity for them in doing so. And so, of course, anticipating the materiality of future events can be a particularly challenging area. And so to help with determining this, IFRS S1 asks you to consider a number of different issues to help you in making that materiality determination. And so here there's a list of things that you could take and that helps you to identify the steps and information to come to this judgment. So for example, you should be considering low probability but high impact outcomes in this determination. And any uncertainties that relate to your future cash flows should be evaluated, for example. So, just being transparent about what those uncertainties are and anything that may affect this judgment is all part of the process. It's important to remember as well that this materiality determination is something that you'll need to continue to assess as your understanding of these risks and opportunities and other events progresses. So it's something to keep revisiting as you move through your reporting each year. Lovely. So I'll hand back to Lois again now.
Thank you, Fiona. And we're on the last section of our implement module now, which is about integrate. And this is really thinking about how different types of processes are integrated with each other. So you might remember when we were talking about the risk management content requirements earlier, we said that one of the requirements is to disclose whether your risk management processes are integrated into the company's overall risk management process. So given the requirements to do with connectivity and wanting to produce coherent reports, this integration point is quite important. So the likelihood is that your company already has existing systems and processes that could be used to help with sustainability-related financial disclosure. So there's probably already processes for corporate governance, risk management, data collection and data quality. And these, we of course encourage you to look at the extent to which existing systems and processes can be used to support sustainability disclosure. But some considerations to take into account on whether you need to adapt those processes or perhaps develop new ones from scratch are listed here in this screen. So some of you have already mentioned this in the mentees. What about a gap analysis to check whether there are gaps in existing systems and processes? Are the existing systems suitable for sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Of course, we know that these risks and opportunities are much more uncertain than other ones. They manifest over different timescales. So might they need to be developed to take account of those particular characteristics? Might you need to apply different or new or adapted prioritization criteria when thinking about sustainability risks and opportunities? For example, as well as probability and likelihood, should there be criteria about vulnerability and speed of onset with these risks? What about controls? Evaluate your existing internal control mechanisms to see how suitable they are. Which contributors need to be involved in the development of sustainability disclosures? What departments will be involved? Perhaps procurement, HR, operations, the risk team, the finance team. Could be quite a number of different teams involved, company secretarial too. And how are they going to be organized? What are the interconnections between different internal and external factors that influence the way in which your processes assess and monitor and prioritize risks and opportunities? How do you deal with uncertainties? When is a measurement uncertainty so great that it can't result in quantitative information, for example, as we've discussed already? How do you deal with those uncertainties? And what resources are in place to manage existing and potentially be used for the development of new systems and processes? Do you need to go through a change management process internally to find those resources or get some more resources? So when we're thinking about these types of processes and systems, one thing that can help is to develop what we call a disclosure plan, which can be a standalone strategy or part of a wider disclosure strategy that's used to think about things like what are your goals and objectives for disclosure and record them in the disclosure plan. What audiences does the company want to communicate with? What are the requirements that it has to comply with through regulation and so on? Who will be involved from the different departments? How will those different departmental inputs be organized? What will be their responsibilities and timelines? How will data be sourced? And what will be the data quality requirements? Can you use existing systems and what are they? Will some or all of the information be assured externally or audited internally, and how will that be done? And what are the sign-off procedures? So a disclosure plan can help with all of these questions, can help the company take control of their own narrative. After all, the requirements do ask about the company's strategy, the company's risks, and so on. It can support this internal collaboration and knowledge sharing and cross-functional team working that we've discussed. And to me, the most important point is this acts as a reference point and an audit trail to show you how the disclosure plan is constructed, by whom, how it's signed off, whether and by whom it's audited, what types of judgments had to be made, and what conclusions and decisions were reached. So there are actually quite a few examples of this type of approach in the public domain now, of companies disclosing what is their disclosure plan, in fact, how they prepared their disclosures. This is an old example now. It's from Hammerson, which is a British property developer, from their 2022 data book. And increasingly, I see companies calling their disclosure plans data books. They set out how they have prepared their disclosures. In this extract, we see that the company describes the basis for their reporting, and this makes it clear to the users of information how they have approached their reporting. So they provide details on the reporting period that applies to the information, the approach and scope of data collection and verification of their reports, and there's lots of other contextual information that they provide in order to help readers understand how they have prepared their report. Now, of course, agreeing this before you start your reporting year is helpful because this ensures there's no surprises at the end of the year. Imagine at the end of the reporting year having to go back and decide how you're going to prepare your report. So let's have another Zoom poll now. We really enjoy your participation. And the question is a disclosure plan required by the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards? You can only pick one answer. So either yes, it's required and you must disclose your plan, or no, but it's a very helpful tool. Thank you all for staying with us and participating. There's a pattern that's emerged, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So most of you said yes, and you must disclose your plan, and some of you said no, but it's a helpful tool. Now, those of you that said no are correct, so well done to those of you that said no. Now, from what we've said, you can see that a disclosure plan is a helpful approach, but the important thing to note is there is nothing in the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards that says you are required to have a disclosure plan and you are required to disclose your plan. There are some parts of the standard that say you must explain what methodology that you've used, what measurement approach you've used, etc., or what your process is, but there's nothing that requires a sort of a coherent disclosure plan. We're just suggesting this as a helpful tool, and indeed we're suggesting that you prepare such a disclosure plan as part of your voluntary homework if you think it will be helpful. Let's do one more poll here. So select the all that apply in this case. A disclosure plan can help a company to take control of its narrative within general purpose financial reports, support collaboration across the company, act as a reference point, an audit trail for disclosure, or enable a company to skip full disclosure as prescribed by the ISSB. I can already see that you all know the answer to this. It's the first three, of course. Having a disclosure plan is not an excuse to skip full disclosure as prescribed by the ISSB. So well done to all of you for understanding the purpose of a disclosure plan. So Fiona's going to take over now to give us a summary of Module 3.
Thanks, Lois. Yes, so thanks everyone for that. And to wrap up, we're just going to recap on a few key points. So let's come back to connections firstly. So we learned in this module that there are many connections between a company and its external and internal environment. And so this is why we really need to focus on identifying risks and opportunities. The second thing we talked about was evaluating those risks and opportunities. And a key component of that evaluation is consistency in assumptions and using scenario analysis to support that. And finally, as we've seen, not starting from scratch is key. So you may already be collecting some data, you might be using it for different purposes to sustainability reporting, but it's often the case that there's something in the background that you can start from. So making sure you have understood that and use what you already have is fantastic. So we'll move on now quickly. We'll just keep it short, but we'll just do a quick Menti exercise again to look at those existing data systems and processes for collecting information. So I can see some of you have been having the opportunity to report your thoughts on this in the background already. So I think probably in the interest of time, we'll focus on going through those responses we have already had, but do feel free to type away if you have any further thoughts to share. So we have here some thoughts already, which is great. So understanding the reporting standards, developing a clear data collection strategy and implementing robust data management systems. Yes, that's definitely all great advice. Using your financial reporting processes and conducting compliance checks and building in audit trails, exactly all great things to consider when you're going about setting this up. utilizing existing systems by adding ESG fields. Yes, exactly. So often the raw underlying data that you need for calculating emissions, for example, is kind of operational business data. So if you could build emissions reporting into those existing systems, that could be a great approach. Using your enterprise planning, resource planning systems. Yes, exactly, same thinking. Doing some audit exactly to understand where you're at with compliance. Great considerations here. Using your operational and maintenance logs. Yes, exactly, great thoughts. And of course, training your employees. Yes, exactly. So it's one thing to have data reporting software and tools, but actually making sure that your relevant employees know how to use it, they understand the importance of collecting data in a consistent and robust way is absolutely integral, so that we make sure we have good inputs to this process. So thank you, everyone. I think there's some great ideas there, which I'll leave you to have a look at as well within Menti. Lovely. So thank you for sharing on that front. I don't think there is too much more that we would highlight that you missed there, but we would just probably encourage you as well to make sure that you're setting up the right governance around data collection as well. So looking at some of those governance structures that we talked about earlier in the session and making sure you have that right setup in place so that if you're building your data processes, it's really clear, you know, which functions have accountability and how you're going to provide the relevant scrutiny over that as well. So great, thank you for that. And I'll now hand over to Robert, who'll be leading the start of Module 4 for us. Thanks, Robert.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Fiona. Yes, indeed. Now we are moving to the final unit of this training, where we'll be focusing on what, when, and where. So a couple of practicalities and administrative things, something important to make sure that you're putting through your information, your message in an efficient and effective way. And in this final unit, we'll have three sections. We'll be talking about location and the timing of your disclosures, efficiency, how to efficiently report, what kind of language, what kind of tools you could use to make it more efficient, and about the confidence. And we'll start with the first one, of the location. And before we will dive into the details, we'll then talk a little bit about this dual purpose reporting model. You could call it holistic reporting package, and how different disclosure frameworks serve different purposes. And on one hand, you have the IFRS, which is providing the information useful to investors. And on the other hand, you have GRI, which is serving a bit broader stakeholder audience. So on the IFRS side, investors already have access to companies' financial statements, and ISSB standards are designed to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities that complement the financial statements. This all come together in a reporting package that we call a general purpose financial reporting. And the requirements of the ISSB standards about what information to report are based on existing sustainability reporting regimes, focused on investor information needs, and on aspects of financial accounting standards. ISSB and GRI reporting standards share some content requirements, for example, what to report, but the ISSB standards are focused only on investors' information needs and decision-making, reflecting the mission of the IFRS Foundation to bring transparency, accountability, and efficiency to capital markets around the world. And both organizations take different approaches to defining materiality, but they're not competing. The GRI approach is set out and understood among sustainability practitioners, whereas the IFRS approach is familiar to accountants and relies heavily on management judgment, aligning corporate risk management processes. A simple example is where a double materiality assessment identifies that some of the company's impacts may have also create sustainability risks, which could be so significant that they are important to disclose to investors. All right, so that's to have in mind those two perspectives. And with this next slide, we will talk again a little bit on the material information. We already touched upon it before, but just to refresh. So what is material information? As we just noted, materiality has different definitions for different reporting standards and audiences. So let's briefly recap what we mean by material information for the IFRS. In identifying material information to be disclosed, a company will first need to identify the sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect its prospects. Once the company has identified those risks and opportunities, it can then determine what information to provide about those risks and opportunities. This is where our definition of materiality definition comes into play. The definition of material information used in S1 is based on and aligned with definition found in the IFRS accounting standards. And this is information that, if omitted, misstated, or obscured by other information, could reasonably be expected to influence investor decisions. In other words, ISSB standards seek to identify disclosure of key information that matters to investors. So we'll talk now about how to disclose material information. Investors have asked for disclosure of material information, and the ISSB standards have been designed to help you gather and disclose it. However, this means that a company does not need to disclose information that is not material, even if the ISSB standards include it as a specific requirement. And it needs to be remembered that we should ensure that material information is clearly identifiable and that you use plain language. You should make sure that the material information is not scattered across your disclosure, and also that any additional non-material disclosures, if required by regulators, should be disclosed, but ensure that it's clearly identified as such. All right, and now we will go to a little Zoom poll. So Zoom poll number 11. Information should be disclosed in the annual report when applying ISSB standards if A, omitting that information could reasonably be expected to influence investors' decisions. B, it could reasonably be expected to affect the company's cash flows. C, it exemplifies the values of the leadership team. So what are which of those three are then the factors affecting their determination of the material information that should be disclosed? A, B, and C. Yeah, it's looking good. Let's wait a little bit longer for your responses. All right, I think we will have now most of the participants there. And yes, you're right. The correct answers are A and B. And so these are the material information is the one which omitting that information could be expected to influence investors' decisions. And B, it could reasonably be expected to affect the company's cash flows. The answer C is not correct. That should not be the factor determining the material information that exemplifies the value of the leadership team. So whoever answered A and B, that's correct. All right. So now we're moving to the next part of this section. I'll be talking about where to report for ISSB. Disclosure on the ISSB standards has to accompany the financial statement and be part of the same general purpose financial reporting package. But S1 does not say where in that reporting package the information should be provided. This is designed to allow jurisdiction-specific requirements on the location of reporting. The most important factor to consider here is to ensure that sustainability disclosures are provided as a part of the same reporting package as the company's financial statements. Sustainability disclosure must be provided at the same time as the related financial statements, cover the same reporting period as the financial statements, and be authorized by the same body or individual authorizing the financial statements. And the research conducted by WBCSD on the state of integrated reporting showed that nearly 2/3 of companies continue to put sustainability information in standalone reports. And then, however, the ISSB standards require material sustainability-related financial disclosures to be included with the general purpose financial reports. So that suggests that there's still way of improvement, and a lot of companies doing it not in accordance with the ISSB requirements. And with that, we will move to the example. Luis, over to you. Oh, sorry.
That's all right. Thank you, Robert.
Oh,
Thank you.
there it is. Thanks.
So this is an example from a Philippines-based conglomerate called Ayala, and they have lots and lots of different activities, property development, banks, healthcare, technology, and so on. And as Robert's been explaining, there are different approaches a company can take as to where they report information and, you know, whether they integrate it with existing disclosures, they provide a separate report, or they provide navigation tools. And what you see in this example is the company setting out in one page their value creation model in the blue box in the middle. And on the outside, the capitals, the types of capital, financial, intellectual, human, and social, that are required as inputs to that value creation model. And then at the far end of the picture, what is the value generated from that business model? So we see the business model, but what they've done is use this as a kind of an index for their report. So you can see the blue arrows take us to where we can find page references to different points, like strategy, page 50, business model, page 54, their stakeholder engagement, page 64. And really what we see here is that there's an integrated approach to reporting, and this snapshot gives us a way of navigating where we can find information both about finances, strategy, ESG priorities, risks and opportunities, inputs to the company, and outcomes. So it's a way of providing that total coherent picture. Of course, the examples we show you today, they're snapshots taken from PDF documents, and assume this kind of that PDFs are created. But of course, digital reporting is also evolving, and that's what Robert's going to explain to us next.
Thank you, Luis. Yes, indeed. Yeah, I'll be talking now a little bit on technicalities and the technological development in the area of disclosures and reporting. So indeed, technology is an emerging considerations for disclosures, and increasingly corporate reporting is moving from PDF reports towards information on web pages with structured data sets, such as those databases offered by stock exchanges. The IFRS Foundation has created the ISSB taxonomy, which reflects the requirements and the accompanying materials for the ISSB standards. So the taxonomy itself does not introduce any new requirements. A digital taxonomy provides the common elements or tags needed to make your sustainability disclosures machine readable. This makes it easier to take large data sets, like information from entire industry, and bring them all together to analyze them. Digital reporting has a number of benefits. It makes the reported information easier to use for analysis. Data is structured the same way across businesses in a machine readable format. Tagging information potentially allows for automated checks for quality and consistency. And more and more data collection and management systems are compatible with digital reporting taxonomies, improving processing and report preparation. And tags can have labels and descriptions in multiple languages. So if you report your quantitative data in one language, someone speaking another language can also understand what it means. Right, and now we're moving to the next unit. In the next section within this unit, we're talking about the efficiency and how to communicate efficiently and effectively. And following this discussion on location and timing, let's now think about ensuring efficient disclosures. We added this to the training because a common comment we find from companies is that there is a growing reporting burden. And what we hope to highlight here is that when done correctly, efficiencies can be made to reduce the burden. So first of all, it's important to understand what effective communication looks like and what is required. Often companies think that if they just put all the information they have into the report, that everyone will be satisfied. This is obviously not true, and this would be against the core concepts, in particular fair presentation. For example, it could be helpful to ask those 3 questions or following questions. Is the information clear and concise? And by clear, we mean it might depend whether the information is clear might depend on the nature of the information. For example, whether it could be clear to present information in tables, graphs, diagrams, plus with accompanying text. And concise, to be concise, disclosures need to avoid boilerplate information, unnecessary duplication of information, and use clear language. And with the next slide, we'll be talking about the quality of information disclosed. Some preparers watching today might be thinking to themselves that they still don't see what is all the fuss about. Perhaps their experience focuses on standalone sustainability reports, or they haven't had much interaction with external audit yet. And to the accountants watching, I would say that be kind to your colleagues, help them understand the difference in rigor that is required in data collection, oversight, sign-off, etc. for financial statements. This means, for example, disclosures include comparative information and are to be restated as necessary. Disclosures should avoid unnecessary duplication and cross-reference instead, as required. Information has to be material, be connected and aggregated or disaggregated appropriately. And I mentioned before cross-referencing, so now I'll be talking a little bit about that more detail. As you may have already noticed, there may appear to be some overlap in the disclosures topics. For example, you might have the same governance approach for all sustainability issues. And then rather to duplicate certain information, you can use cross-referencing to enhance efficiency of your disclosures. And cross-referencing to other reports is permitted as long as the other report is available on the same terms and in the same time as the sustainability disclosures. The cross-referenced information is assumed to become a part of the reporting package. Cross-referencing shall be applied consistently and transparently. It shall not result in the information becoming more difficult to understand. And yeah, indeed, to better understand this, we will have the example on that. And Lois, over to you.
Thanks, Robert. Yes, this example is from a company based in Ireland called CRH, which is a manufacturer and supplier of products for the construction industry. Now, at the top of the page, the company tells us that this is about the impact of climate change and carbon emission reductions targets, but it's actually the impact cross-referenced to what we see in the financial statements. Now, this was produced in 2022, this annual report. So I've just put in the chat a link to a consultation that the IFRS Foundation is currently carrying out on climate-related risks in the financial statement. So although we have this example, please bear in mind when you're thinking about financial statements that we also have this consultation in progress now. But at the start of the paragraph, CIH tells us where we can find the risks that they have, the climate risks that they've identified, and what reduction efforts they're taking into account and that might affect the preparation of the financial statements. So the presumption, I think, for many is, well, if you have a plan to reduce your emissions, if you have a transition plan or something like that, it might have an effect on the financial statements. In the middle of this extract, under the title Climate Change and Carbon Emission Reductions Targets References, we see line items and references to pages where the company has considered the effect, for example, on impairment testing, on the useful life of assets, on provisions for liabilities, inventories, and so on. Now, what this company concluded, having been through the assessment of whether there are any effects of climate-related risks, opportunities, and strategies on these line items, they have concluded that there are no material impact on the financial statements as a result of those risks. They've used their normal accounting policies, estimates, and underlying assumptions to make this judgment. And we see which particular parts of the financial statements they've looked at and what they've tested. So they've concluded that there are no material impacts, but it's useful for investors to know this information because they know that the company has at least considered the effect on the financial statements. So back to you now, Robert, for mechanisms that support adoption.
Yes, great. Thank you, Liz. Indeed, we'll be now looking at some mechanisms which should make your reporting easier and offer some flexibility in application of the ISSB standards. So at IFRS, we sought to apply a number of mechanisms to support preparers to get started with the ISSB standards. First of all, one simple thing put in place was to adopt well-known terminology and concepts familiar to preparers borrowing from the ISSB standards, for example. Secondly, many requirements in S1 and S2 are to be applied proportionally, recognizing companies will have a range of capabilities and preparedness on these issues. For example, qualitative scenario analysis is permitted, and you will see the phrase all reasonable and supportable information at the reporting date without undue cost or effort, or commensurate with skills, capabilities, and resources in a number of places. There are a number of reliefs as well, and the reliefs for the first year of application have also been introduced and include companies being able to limit disclosures to climate in year 1 and begin reporting on their other sustainability-related risk and opportunities in year 2. The other relief is that the companies being able to provide annual sustainability-related financial disclosures with their next half-year reporting rather than at the same time as the financial statements. Additionally, companies not needing to provide disclosures about Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions apply the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard to measure emissions if they are already using a different management approach or provide comparative information in their first year of reporting using S1 or S2. Another relief allows companies to include greenhouse gas emissions information obtained from companies in the value chain with a different reporting cycle. And finally, as we already mentioned, a number of other sources of guidance and resources, including ISSB standards, CDSB framework application guidance, among many others. And these reliefs are designed to enable companies to put in place reporting practices and structures to provide high quality, decision useful information. And jurisdiction will decide when to mandate adoption, but the standards are effective from January 2024. And we know many companies are now preparing to adopt them voluntarily as well. All right, and I'll be moving to two Zumpols. Zumpol number 12. And the four possible answers. So information disclosed in accordance with the ISSB standards should be, and therefore qualities should be decision useful material, C, misleading, and comparable. Which of those are correct? Great. That's looking good indeed. There's more answers coming in. All right. I think there you have. Indeed, most of you answered correctly. Obviously, the information disclosed should not be misleading, but should be decision useful material and comparable. So whoever answered that is correct. So well done. With the next Zumpol number 13, information is decision useful if it is, and then we have relevant and faithfully represent what it purports to represent. B, comparable. C, verifiable. D, timely. E, understandable. So which of those are the right answers to determine whether the information is decision useful? Great. Yeah, it's looking good. Indeed, all the answers are correct. So all these 5 qualities of the information would determine that it's decision useful. So it's relevant and faithfully represent. It should be comparable, verifiable, timely, and then understandable. So again, good job here. All right, and we're moving to the next section within this unit. We'll be talking about confidence and maximization of the confidence in disclosed information. In this section of our last unit, we look at how you can ensure that the users of financial reports have confidence in the data you are disclosing, as trust is an essential component of sustainability-related disclosures, and increasingly so with the growing concern over greenwashing. And let's look at the comparative information and what it is and why is it important. An important trust builder is showing data and trends over time. This is why ISSB standard asks for comparatives. And comparative information provides context and helps to indicate progress and underpin strategy and risk management. And metrics disclosed by a company might be redefined or replaced over time, or the company might change its method for estimating a metric. In these situations, it is important for the company to revise the comparatives to enable investors to compare and analyze current period figures with the relevant prior period figures. And also, occasionally, a company's sustainability disclosures might contain material errors. In this situation, the company is required to restate these errors in the comparatives provided. Revisions or restatements are necessary only when there is a risk that material information being omitted, misstated, or obscured as a result of not revising or restating the comparatives. Information can be qualitative and quantitative. Companies sometimes express concern with sharing the information that they deem to be sensitive, or that if they shared or that if shared, it could deplete their competitive advantage. The ISSB standards relieve a company from disclosing information about sustainability-related opportunity if that information is commercially sensitive. If this is a concern you have, there is a further detail you can read in the handout. All right. So now with this final section, we will talk about the statement of compliance. So finally, it's important to build confidence by providing clear statements of compliance. A company that complies with all the requirements in the ISSB standards, even the reliefs, is required to make an explicit statement of compliance. We are publishing a further guidance on this topic. I will provide you a link to this document in the chat in a moment. Right, and with the last slide, this is the list summarizing of the things we've been discussing. Then please walk through the list. You can find in the handouts slide deck an additional slide in the section with reminders on how to report effectively. And I do highly recommend reviewing that. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Robert. That's great. And that brings us to the end of the final module, as you said. So in our closing minutes, I'll just be rattling through a few slides, so bear with me. But we just wanted to wrap up really with some key messages from this module. So clarity on that audience of investors with reporting, really focusing on that material information and being as concise as you can be, and thinking about that confidence in data and setting up the right reporting processes to be confident in your reporting and that you have a clear audit trail. So I will just skip the final Menti in the interest of time, but you'll be able to work through this exercise in your handout as well around thinking about navigation approaches. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. I will just revisit the Menti quickly. So if you have it open, you should see a question now asking you to look at the learning objectives from this session and revisiting where you're up to against those learning objectives. So I'd really encourage you to let us know if you think you're in a stronger position now, perhaps than you were when you started the session. I'll just flash it up quite briefly so we can see what your thoughts are on that. But I'll leave the poll open in the background as well, so you can continue to respond to us if you don't get the chance. But we're seeing many of you saying that you feel now much more comfortable than you did at the start of the session with those different areas that we were hoping to achieve today. So obviously that's fantastic to hear that you feel now more confident in all of those topics. So do let us know, but thank you for completing that. So I'll just leave that open in the background so you can let us know. And then in the meantime, there'll be another Menti that I'll just move to as well to let us know your thoughts on how you thought the training went and any improvement areas as well. So do take a moment to let us know on that too. But finally, I'll just touch on the assignment again briefly as an optional follow-on activity you may like to do. This is obviously the way to take forward your learning and to really reflect and apply what we've learned today. So I'd encourage you to look at the web page as we've linked to you in the chat and to download this handout if you'd like to use it to help you with developing your draft disclosure plan and really taking things forwards. So just a few resources to flash up quickly, which you'll see within the slide materials, but you can really continue your learning on this topic through looking at a lot of the resources that we have highlighted today. So if you look on the IFRS Knowledge Hub, you'll see regular resources added to continue to update on the standards as new aspects come out. So do continue to check this resource. And of course, there are the two key standards themselves, which are always a very good place to refer back to when in doubt. So I'm sure we have some accountants here who love a good standard. So do make sure you look through that detail as well in your own time. And then as our colleague Amira mentioned at the start of the session, we would really encourage making use of the IFC's Beyond the Balance Sheet toolkit as well, provides a fantastic end-to-end set of resources covering not just sustainability, but also broader issues of corporate governance and reporting. So a really helpful resource to refer to on that front as well. And finally, I think we mentioned these to you already, but the UN SSE Toolkit, which you can access on our website, is another great resource to help you out here. And do continue to keep an eye on our Academy webpage and sign up to our mailing list to hear about future training courses as well as we roll those out. We've also mentioned earlier that you'll be eligible to receive a certificate. So a big well done for all of you who've attended with us for 3.5 hours. We know that's a lot of time and we're really appreciative of that. So if you've attended with us live in the session online, if you complete the feedback survey that we're sharing the link to and that you'll get from follow-up in an email from Zoom as well, you'll receive this certificate. Please do give us a week or so to send those certificates out, however, before you send any chases, but we'll have those to you as soon as we can. And then finally, just a final thank you to SSE's official supporters who make a big contribution towards allowing us to promote this work and to deliver the training. So a big reminder to anyone working in an organisation that might be relevant here that our supporters receive early access to all of our training materials. And so it's a great initiative to get involved in. So do reach out to us with our contact details if you'd like to hear more about that. Finally, we'd just like to thank the Amman Stock Exchange, Dr. Rasha, again for hosting today's session and for having us with you. It's been fantastic. And of course, to our partners at IFC and the IFRS Foundation for joining us today and for sharing their expertise with us. And of course, a final thank you to all of you for your engagement in today's session. It makes it so much more interesting for us to get your thoughts and input to the exercises. So we really do appreciate that. So thank you very much again. We hope to see you at a future training course and we'll close off the session there, but have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.